tonight you will find yourself in another place, another time. The air is softer here, the pace is slower, and the world moves without urgency, without noise, without interruption. There's nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to go. You can simply observe and let each moment pass as gently as it arrives. If you find this kind of quiet storytelling helpful, please subscribe and return whenever you need a moment of rest. You can always try one of the other videos. If you'd like the story to continue while you sleep, you can set the video to loop. Now, take a slow breath and let the world around you begin to fade. As you drift into the quiet rhythm of history, now close your eyes and picture this, a mountain so steep that the morning fog never quite leaves it, clinging to the terraced hillsides like something the mountain has decided to keep for itself. The air is cool and damp and smells of wet soil and green things. Somewhere below you, through a shifting curtain of white mist, a valley opens up, ancient, unhurried, enormous. You are standing in Yunnan province in the southwest of China, roughly 4,000 years ago, give or take a few centuries, and the plant at your feet has no idea yet that it is about to quietly, politely, and with enormous good manners change the entire world. Before we get into anything else, I want you to get comfortable. Pull a blanket over yourself. Set that phone face down or let it rest on the pillow beside you. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you'd like, drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. I genuinely love reading those. There is something extraordinary about knowing someone in a quiet room in New Zealand, or a warm apartment in Portugal, or a cold night in Chicago is drifting off to the same story. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The plant at your feet is called Camellia sinensis, and it is not impressive to look at. It is, honestly, a bit of a shrub. It has small, waxy, oval leaves with serrated edges. It produces tiny white flowers with yellow stamens. If you walk past it on a hiking trail, you would not stop. You would not photograph it. You might step on it. And yet, this modest little plant, found in the borderlands of what is now southwestern China, northern Myanmar, and northeastern India, would eventually be carried by camel and mule and ship and human back across approximately half the surface of the earth, would become the currency of empires and the comfort of the poor and the obsession of queens, and would lead, indirectly but undeniably, to revolutions, wars, and the strange and peculiar ritual of the British afternoon tea. Historians still argue whether tea was first cultivated in Yunnan, Sichuan, or across the border in what is now Myanmar, though DNA analysis of the plant strongly suggests that the point of origin lies near the intersection of latitude 29 degrees north and longitude 98 degrees east, which sounds very technical until you look at a map and realize it is essentially one of the most dramatic pieces of geography on Earth, the point where China, Tibet, India, and Myanmar all meet in a tangle of the world's deepest river gorges and highest mountain passes. The most popular legend, and it is a good one, so let's not rush past it, involves the mythological Emperor Shen Nong, sometimes called the Divine Farmer, in around 2737 BC. He was a ruler of early Chinese civilization who, according to legend, made it his mission to taste hundreds of plants and herbs to understand their medicinal properties. He was essentially the world's first pharmacologist, if you overlook the part where he was divine and semi-mythological. The story goes that one afternoon he was sitting outside beneath a tree, boiling water the way he always boiled water, because Shen Nong reportedly believed boiled water was safer to drink, which is a remarkably sophisticated understanding of hygiene for 2737 BC. And a few leaves drifted down from a nearby branch and fell into his pot. He tasted the resulting liquid. He liked it. He noted that it made him feel alert and clear-headed, but also calm. He was, in other words, the first person in recorded legend to have a cup of tea, and if there is justice in this world, his ghost gets a free cup of whatever he likes for eternity. Now, the honest scholarly version of events is considerably murkier. The Chinese character for tea, written as cha and pronounced cha, only appears in a Chinese dictionary around 350 AD, which tells you something about how long it took even the language to fully commit to this beverage. Earlier records use a different character, tu or tu, which referred to a variety of bitter plants. Archaeological evidence is more concrete. Researchers working in the mountains of Zhejiang province found ancient roots of the Camellia sinensis plant alongside broken pottery fragments, and after a decade of careful analysis, published findings in 2015 confirming those roots were approximately 6,000 years old, meaning the Hemidu culture, a Neolithic people who flourished in that region somewhere between 7,000 and 6,000 BC, were almost certainly cultivating or at minimum using the plant. 6,000 years old. Let that settle over you for a moment, like a warm blanket. 6,000 years ago, before the pyramids of Egypt were built, before the Bronze Age properly got underway, before anyone had written Homer or laid the first stone of Rome, someone in China was doing something with this plant. We do not know exactly what they were doing with it. They may have been chewing the leaves raw. They may have been boiling them with other herbs as a medicinal treatment. They may have been using it as a food ingredient, but the plant was there, and the people were there, and something was happening. Tea's earliest definitive appearance in a text comes later, a 3rd century AD medical document by the Chinese physician Hua Tuo, who recommended tea as a treatment for fatigue and mental clarity. By the Shang dynasty, which ran roughly from 1600 to 1046 BC, there is evidence that tea was consumed as a medicinal concoction, not sipped for pleasure, not served to guests, but used the way we might use a supplement or a tincture today. The idea of drinking it simply because it was delicious came later, slowly, the way good things often do. What this means is that before tea became a trade good, before it traveled any road at all, it spent centuries as a medicine. It was bitter and green and slightly strange. It woke you up without making you jittery. It soothed digestion. It was thought to clear the mind. People who worked in the fields, people who studied texts by candlelight, people who needed to be sharp and focused, they all had reason to seek it out. And as the population of China grew and its civilization expanded outward from its early heartlands into new territories. The knowledge of this plant and what it could do traveled with them. We are not yet on the Silk Road, mule. We are not yet anywhere near a camel, but we have met the plant, and we know what it is capable of, and that is the best possible place to begin. The fog is still on the mountain. The leaves are still wet. The story is just getting started. The mountains of Yunnan in southwestern China are not modest mountains. They are the kind of mountains that make you reconsider your ideas about scale. Ridgelines that vanish into cloud. Valleys so deep, the river at the bottom is just a sound, a faint rushing, something felt rather than seen. The soil up here is red and acidic and rich, precisely the kind of soil that Camellia sinensis prefers. The rainfall comes heavy and reliable. The temperature swings between warm days and cool nights in a rhythm that stresses the plant just enough to concentrate its oils and compounds and everything that makes a leaf worth drinking. In these mountains, the tea plant grew wild long before anyone thought to cultivate it. Ancient trees, not bushes, actual trees, spread their canopies over the forest floor, some of them reaching heights of 30 feet or more, their trunks thick and gnarled, their roots driving deep into the red hillside earth. On the Jingmai mountain in Yunnan province, some of these ancient tea trees are estimated to be over 1,000 years old, and farmers still harvest from them today, climbing carefully into the high branches the way their grandparents' grandparents did, picking by hand, one leaf at a time. That image, one leaf at a time, is worth holding on to as we talk about how tea was first harvested and processed, because it tells you something essential about the relationship between the plant and the people who worked with it. Tea has never been an extractive crop in the way that some agricultural products are. You do not strip the plant bare. You take what is ready. You leave the rest. You come back later. The earliest forms of tea preparation were almost nothing like what ends up in your cup today. During the Han Dynasty, which ran from about 206 BC to 220 AD, tea was often simply compressed into cakes or bricks. The fresh leaves were steamed, pounded in a mortar, packed into molds, and dried. This produced a dense, compact product that could be stored, transported, and traded without crumbling into dust or rotting on the road. To drink it, you would break off a chunk, roast it briefly over a fire, crush it into powder, and whisk it into hot water. The resulting liquid was thick, slightly frothy, and often seasoned. Early Tang Dynasty drinkers, for instance, liked to add salt, onion, ginger, or orange peel to their tea, which sounds eccentric until you remember that they were treating it the way we might treat a broth or a tonic rather than a delicate beverage. This will make a certain man named Lu Yu absolutely furious, and we will get to him shortly. The harvesting itself follows rules that developed over centuries of observation and were eventually written down with a specificity that borders on the ceremonial. The first and most prized flush of the year, the spring harvest, comes from the youngest leaves, the ones that have barely unfurled, still soft and pale green, still carrying the concentrated energy of winter's rest. Pickers would look for what they called a bud and one leaf, or bud and two leaves, the terminal bud of a new shoot, plus one or two of the small tender leaves immediately below it. These were the most delicate, the most aromatic, the most valuable. Older, tougher leaves lower on the stem were suitable for lower grades of tea. the kind that went to common people or, later, compressed into bricks for trade with the Tibetan plateau. The work of picking tea is painstaking, and it is almost entirely done by hand. On a good day, a skilled picker harvesting by the bud and 2 leaves standard might gather around 10 to 15 pounds of fresh leaves, which, once processed, would yield only about 2 to 4 pounds of finished tea, because the leaves lose an enormous amount of moisture during production. This ratio explains, without needing any further elaboration, why quality tea has always been expensive. After picking, the leaves begin their transformation almost immediately. Left in a pile, they will start to oxidize, the same chemical process that browns a sliced apple or a bruised banana. The question of how much oxidation you allow determines what kind of tea you end up with, and this is where the art of the tea maker enters the picture. Green tea is oxidized as little as possible. The leaves are heated quickly after harvest to halt the enzymes responsible for browning, a process the Chinese call shocking, which translates roughly as killing the green. Using either steam or a dry pan over high heat, white tea undergoes minimal processing, just gentle withering and drying. Oolong is partially oxidized. Black tea, the kind that eventually made the journey to England and never quite left, is fully oxidized. The leaves turn dark and rich and malty, robust enough to survive a long sea voyage and still taste like something worth the trouble. The particular process for making black tea worthy of the Silk Road trade involved a kind of deliberate toughening. After withering the freshly picked leaves, spreading them out thin on bamboo mats in a cool, ventilated space for anywhere from 12 to 24 hours, letting moisture slowly evaporate and the leaves soften and become pliable, workers would roll them, using the palms of the hands in a firm, circular motion, breaking the cell walls and encouraging oxidation. Then the leaves would be spread out again, this time in a warm, humid environment, turning dark and fragrant as the oxidation worked through them. Finally, they would be fired, dried over heat to arrest the process and reduce the moisture content to somewhere around 5 or 6%, a level at which the tea would not mold and could survive the conditions of a long trade journey. Historians still argue whether the specific processing techniques that produced tea suitable for the overland trade routes, particularly the heavily compressed dark teas known as hei cha, which not only survived but actually improved over the months of travel, were developed deliberately or discovered by accident. One story claims that Lapsang Souchong, the famous smoked black tea from the Wuyi Mountains of Fujian province, came about because soldiers camped inside a tea factory during the final years of the Ming dynasty, delaying production long enough that the leaves over-oxidized, and the tea maker, rather than waste the crop, salvaged it by drying the leaves over a fire built from pine branches. The result was a tea with a deep, smoky, resinous flavor that certain people, mostly people who were not expecting it, found absolutely magnificent, and other people found alarming. To this day, Lapsang Souchong divides opinion at the breakfast table. What is not in any doubt is that by the time the Tang dynasty arrived, that golden era from 618 to 907 AD, when China was perhaps the most sophisticated and cosmopolitan civilization on earth, the art of processing tea had developed into something genuinely complex. There were rules, there were standards, there were regional variations and debates about quality and the correct way to prepare water, and which kind of firewood produced the best heat, and what the ideal vessel was, and how many seconds the leaves should steep. Tea had moved from being a medicine taken by necessity to being a pleasure sought by choice, and from there to being a cultural institution with its own vocabulary and philosophy and sense of propriety. And into the middle of all of this stepped a man who had been abandoned as a baby at a monastery, raised by monks, fled the monastery at age 12, spent time as a traveling clown and performer, somehow educated himself into one of the greatest scholars of his age, and then dedicated his life to writing the single most important document in the history of tea. His name was Lu Yu, and he wrote the Cha Jing, the classic of tea, between approximately 760 and 762 AD. It is a small book, roughly 7,000 Chinese characters long, which is nothing in a literary tradition that values enormity, but it is dense and precise and serious, and it covers everything: the origins of the tea plant and its botanical characteristics, the correct soils and climates for cultivation, the tools required for harvesting and processing, the ideal water sources. Lu Yu had strong opinions about which rivers produced the best water and ranked them, the proper equipment for brewing, the correct way to serve, the cultural and spiritual dimensions of the act of drinking tea itself. Lu Yu believed that tea was not just a drink. He believed it was a pathway to harmony, to mindfulness, to a particular quality of attention that the chaos of daily life tended to obscure. He believed, and this is worth sitting with quietly for a moment, that the making and sharing of tea was a form of meditation, a way of connecting with the natural world through a series of deliberate, careful actions performed with full awareness. He disapproved of adulterating tea with spices or seasonings. He disapproved of careless preparation. He had the energy of someone who has found the thing that matters to them and is absolutely not going to let anyone do it badly in their presence. After the classic of tea was published, drinking tea became wildly fashionable across China, not because Lu Yu told people to do it, but because he gave them a language for what they were already feeling. He articulated something that drinkers sensed but could not say, and that articulation spread, and the fashion spread with it, all the way to the borders of the empire and beyond, toward the high passes of the mountains and the long, wind-blasted road that led west. The leaves were ready. The road was waiting. Picture a city at the edge of the known world, or rather, at the edge of one world and the beginning of another. The city is called Chang'an, and in the Tang dynasty it is the largest city on earth. Its population is somewhere around 1 million people, which is a number so staggering for the 7th century that it barely seems real. It has a grid of wide, straight avenues laid out with the kind of geometric confidence that only an empire at the absolute peak of its self-belief can manage. Its markets sell silk and jade and lacquerware and medicines and animals and ideas. Its tea houses are full of scholars and merchants and monks and poets. Its western gate opens onto a road that stretches, with various interruptions and detours and moments of genuine terror, all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. This is Chang'an, modern-day Xi'an, and it is the eastern terminus of the Silk Road, The name Silk Road was not actually used by anyone who traveled it. The term was coined in 1877 by a German geographer named Baron Ferdinand von Richthofen, who gave it the name in a scholarly publication about Central Asian trade routes. The people who spent months crossing the Taklamakan Desert on camelback did not think of themselves as being on the Silk Road. They thought of themselves as being on the road to Samarkand, or the road from Dunhuang, or the particular punishing stretch of track that ran along the northern rim of the Tarim Basin, with the desert on one side and the Tian Shan Mountains on the other, the wind picking up grit and flinging it into every exposed surface of the human face. Naming it something elegant came later, after the danger had become history. The network itself had been in operation in some form since at least the 2nd century BC, when the Han Dynasty Emperor Wu sent his envoy, Zhang Qian, westward into Central Asia in around 114 BC, partly as a diplomatic mission, partly to forge military alliances against the Xiongnu nomads who raided the northern frontier, and partly, one suspects, because Zhang Qian was the kind of man who made his emperor nervous when he had nothing to do. Zhang Qian's journey took 13 years and involved being captured by the Xiongnu not once, but twice. He returned with extraordinary intelligence about the lands to the west, the Fergana Valley and its famous blood-sweating horses, the kingdoms of Bactria and Parthia, the distant empire of Rome. He had been gone so long that the emperor had given him up for dead. What Zhang Qian brought back changed Chinese foreign policy and opened the road in a formal sense, establishing the first official connections between China and Central Asia. For the first couple of centuries of Silk Road activity, tea was not a significant trade commodity moving westward. Silk was the star of the show. Silk so fine and lustrous that Roman senators draped themselves in it and paid extraordinary sums for the privilege, to the irritation of Roman moralists who thought the whole thing was decadent and also possibly indecent. China also exported porcelain, jade, bronze goods, and paper. In exchange, goods flowed eastward. Horses, which China desperately needed for its military, along with glass, gold, silver, woolen textiles, and a variety of luxury goods from the Mediterranean world. Tea's formal entry into the Silk Road trade happened gradually, and the evidence for its timing has been dramatically revised by archaeological work published in 2016. Researchers extracted plant remains from 2 sites, one near Chang'an itself and one in the Ngari region of western Tibet, and identified the chemical markers of Camellia sinensis through biomolecular analysis. The results showed that tea was being transported towards Central Asia by approximately 200 AD, several hundred years earlier than previously documented. The finds from the Tibetan site confirmed the existence of a branch of the Silk Road running across the Tibetan plateau that historians had suspected but never been able to prove physically. Tea had gotten to the edge of the known world and then kept going, well before anyone thought to write it down. By the Tang Dynasty, that great flourishing that Lu Yu inhabited and that made Chang'an the crossroads of the known world, tea had become a fully established element of the trade caravans heading westward. And this is where we need to talk about the logistics, because the logistics are both extraordinary and quietly brutal, and they tell you a great deal about how much people wanted this leaf. The Silk Road is not actually a road. It is a network of roads, a braided set of routes that shift and change over centuries depending on political conditions, the availability of water, the security of particular stretches, and which empire currently controls which oasis. It runs roughly 4,000 miles from Chang'an to the Levant, though individual merchants rarely traveled the entire length. The standard arrangement involved a series of middlemen. A merchant would carry goods from one city to the next trading hub, sell or exchange them there, and a different merchant would carry them the next leg of the journey. The goods pass through many hands before reaching their final destination, each transaction adding cost and distance, and sometimes a small amendment to the story of where things came from. The terrain along the way is not polite. Leaving Chang'an heading northwest, the road follows the Hexi Corridor, a narrow strip of habitable land between the Gobi Desert to the north and the Tibetan Plateau to the south, for several hundred miles before reaching the oasis town of Dunhuang, the last significant settlement before the desert truly begins. From Dunhuang, traders had a choice of routes skirting the edges of the Taklamakan Desert, one of the most arid places on the planet. The northern route ran through a string of oasis cities, Turfan, Kucha, Kashgar, along the base of the Tian Shan Range. The southern route went through Khotan and Yarkand, skirting the desert's opposite edge. Both routes eventually converged at Kashgar, a trading hub at the western end of the Tarim Basin, before climbing into the Pamir Mountains, a range so high and cold and difficult that merchants called them the roof of the world, which they meant not as poetry but as a warning. Beyond the Pamirs lay the great cities of Central Asia, Samarkand and Bukhara in what is now Uzbekistan, magnificent cosmopolitan places where Persian, Turkish, Chinese, and Indian cultures all blended into something unique and dazzling. From there, the road continued westward through Persia and into the Levant, where goods could be loaded onto Mediterranean ships and sent on to Alexandria, Constantinople, Rome. The animals that carried the cargo across this landscape were, overwhelmingly, Bactrian camels, the two-humped variety native to Central Asia, built for exactly this kind of work. They are extraordinary creatures. They can carry loads of up to 600 pounds. They can go for days without water by metabolizing the fat stored in their humps. Their broad, padded feet spread their weight across sand and do not sink the way a horse's hooves would. Their nostrils can close completely against a sandstorm. Their thick eyelashes and double-layered eyelids protect their eyes from blowing grit. They have a reputation for bad temper, which is completely justified, and for stubbornness, which is also completely justified. And they were so essential to the functioning of the Silk Road that calling them ships of the desert was not a metaphor. It was a description of their economic role. A single caravan might include dozens or hundreds of camels, each loaded with goods, moving at roughly 25 miles per day through whatever the landscape chose to throw at them. The caravans traveled in company for safety, because the road was not without bandits, and because there is psychological comfort in numbers when the landscape is trying to kill you. Over time, a system of caravanserais developed along the route, large inns with enclosed courtyards where caravans could shelter, water their animals, repair equipment, trade information, and sleep without one eye open. Some of these were simple stone enclosures. Others were elaborate complexes with separate quarters for merchants and animals, covered arcades, wells, storerooms. They were the service stations of the ancient world, and the conversations that happened in them. A Sogdian merchant from Samarkand comparing notes with a Chinese silk trader from Loyang, a Buddhist monk from Kushan, showing a Nestorian Christian from Syria a new manuscript, were, over centuries, the mechanism by which ideas as well as goods traveled the road. Historians still argue whether the Silk Road's most significant contribution to world history was material, the movement of silk and spices and tea and glass, or intellectual, the exchange of religions, philosophies, agricultural techniques, mathematical concepts, and artistic styles that happened alongside the commerce. The honest answer is probably that you cannot separate the two, that the goods traveled in the same boats as the ideas, and that a merchant who spent 3 months crossing a desert with a Buddhist monk was going to come home with his mind changed as well as his pockets full. Tea arrived at all of this with peculiar timing, and to carry it any distance at all, someone first had to solve the problem of keeping it alive on the road. Here is a problem that no amount of philosophical appreciation for tea can solve. Fresh tea leaves rot, not dramatically, not with the kind of spectacular decay that makes a good story, but quietly and thoroughly, going brown and slimy and useless within days of being picked, if left to their own devices. A journey from the tea gardens of Yunnan or Fujian to the markets of Samarkand took months. A journey to Constantinople or the edge of the Mediterranean took considerably longer. You could not simply wrap fresh leaves in cloth, toss them over a camel's back, and expect anything drinkable to arrive at the other end. The road required a solution, and the solution that ancient Chinese traders developed was one of the most elegant pieces of practical engineering in the history of food. The tea brick. The making of a tea brick begins with the tea itself, typically the larger, coarser leaves from lower on the plant, along with stems and leaf fragments that would not qualify for the fine, loose teas consumed at court or by the wealthy. These were not necessarily inferior in a contemptible way. They were simply a different product suited to a different purpose. For the compressed brick trade, particularly the dark tea or hei-cha varieties destined for Tibet, Mongolia, and the long western routes, the leaves often underwent a specific additional process called wodui, a controlled piling or wet fermentation in which the tea was heaped in a moist environment and allowed to undergo microbial transformation over a period of weeks. The heat generated by this process and the bacterial and fungal activity within it fundamentally changed the character of the tea. It became darker, earthier, smoother, less astringent, with a flavor profile that aged rather than deteriorated over time. This was not an accident. This was the tea equivalent of making cheese, a controlled transformation using living organisms to produce something that could travel and survive and even improve on the journey. Once the fermentation was complete, the leaves were steamed to soften them and then pressed into molds, rectangular blocks, round cakes, or various other shapes depending on the region and the intended market. The pressing was done with considerable force, by hand or using heavy stone or wooden presses, compacting the leaves into a dense mass that would hold its shape when the mold was removed. The freshly formed brick was then set aside to cure and dry, a process that could take weeks, during which the block hardened and stabilized. The finished article was something between a food and a currency, compact, standardized in weight, durable, and valuable in a way that could be universally understood even across language barriers. The dimensions and weight of tea bricks were not arbitrary. They were calibrated for transport. A standard brick weighed somewhere between 1 and 5 pounds, depending on the grade and destination, sized to stack efficiently on the back of a camel or mule, to fit into the panniers and pack frames that had been developed over centuries of caravan experience. Multiple bricks would be wrapped together in paper or cloth, then sometimes sewn into yak skin wrappings that added a further layer of protection against moisture, impact, and the general indignity of being carried across a mountain range. The yak skin wrapping had the additional useful property of being slightly fragrant itself, which mixed with the already complex aroma of the aged dark tea inside in ways that contemporary tasters describe as earthy, leathery, and intensely mineral. An acquired taste, certainly, but one that millions of people across Central Asia acquired with considerable enthusiasm. In Tibet, the value of tea bricks was genuinely extraordinary. Tibetans had no tea plant of their own. The altitude is too extreme, the growing season too short, the conditions too harsh for Camellia sinensis, which likes things warmer and wetter. But Tibetans had developed a profound need for tea, particularly given their diet, which was dominated by yak meat, yak butter, zampa, roasted barley flour, and very little in the way of fresh vegetables or fruit. Tea, with its polyphenols and antioxidants and mild stimulant properties, filled nutritional and physiological gaps that the high-altitude diet created. It also mixed beautifully with yak butter and salt to produce a thick, warming, calorie-dense beverage that sustained people working at extreme elevations in extreme cold. Tibetan butter tea, pocha, is not what most people who grew up drinking English breakfast imagine when they think of tea. But at 14,000 feet in a Himalayan winter, you would drink it with deep gratitude and ask for seconds. The result of this mutual need was one of the most formalized trade relationships in Central Asian history, the Tea Horse Road, or Chamadao, which the Chinese also called the Chamagudao, the ancient Tea Horse Road. This network of caravan paths wound through the mountains of Sichuan, Yunnan, and Tibet, carrying tea in one direction and horses in the other, and it operated for over 1,000 years, from roughly the Tang Dynasty through to the beginning of the 20th century. The horses that came down from Tibet in exchange for tea were sturdy, cold-adapted mountain animals, shorter and stockier than the famous Fergana horses that Chinese emperors had coveted centuries earlier, but eminently suited to military service in the borderlands. For the Chinese government, the exchange was strategic as much as commercial. Tea kept Tibet supplied and relatively pacified, and horses kept the Chinese army functional. The economics of this exchange were not subtle. During the Song dynasty, from 960 to 1279 AD, the government established formal tea and horse agencies, official bureaucratic bodies whose sole function was to regulate the trade, fix exchange rates, and ensure neither side cheated. At various points, the official rate was set at something like 1 horse for approximately 130 pounds of tea, though this fluctuated wildly depending on military need and harvest quality. When the northern nomads were pressing hard on the Chinese frontier and cavalry was urgently needed, the rate moved in Tibet's favor. When tea harvests were poor, it moved the other way. The whole system had the complexity and the occasional absurdity of a modern commodities market, except that instead of electronic trading screens, it was operated by officials in silk robes, arguing in mountain passes. Tea bricks also functioned as currency in Mongolia, where they circulated alongside metal coins and were used as a unit of account for transactions of all kinds. You could hire a laborer for so many bricks of tea, purchase a sheep for a certain number, settle a debt in bricks. This was not unique to Mongolia. Versions of tea brick currency appeared wherever the compressed bricks traveled, because they had the properties that good currency requires. They were standardized, they were durable, they were divisible. You could break a brick into smaller pieces, and crucially, they were desirable in themselves regardless of their nominal exchange value. Unlike a coin, whose value depended entirely on trust in the issuing authority, a tea brick was worth something even to someone who had never heard of whatever dynasty had pressed it. You could always drink it. There was even a grading system built into the bricks for the Tibetan and Mongolian markets. The finest quality bricks, made entirely from high-grade compressed leaf, were reserved for senior Buddhist clergy. The middle grades, with some stem material mixed in, went to monks of lesser rank. The lowest grades, coarser leaves, more stems, less careful processing, went to ordinary people who needed the nutrition and the warmth and were not particularly interested in the subtleties. This is perhaps the earliest documented example of tea being used as a social marker, a way of communicating status through what kind of brick you were served, which is a tradition that Britain would eventually take to levels of nuance that would astonish even the most class-conscious Tang Dynasty official. Getting the bricks from the tea gardens to the caravans involved its own chain of labor, and it is worth pausing here to think about the people who did that work, because they have largely been written out of the story in favor of the merchants and the emperors. The tea gardens of Yunnan and Sichuan were worked by farmers, often family operations with knowledge of specific gardens and processing techniques passed down through generations, who grew the trees, harvested the leaves, and either processed the tea themselves or sold the raw leaves to processing workshops. The porters who carried the compressed bricks from the mountain gardens down to the trading towns did so on their backs, using wooden pack frames called beijia, pronounced beijia, stacked so high with bricks that the men carrying them often needed a forked stick to prop themselves upright when they stopped to rest, because the load was too heavy to set down and lift again unaided. A single porter might carry 200 to 300 pounds of tea brick over mountain trails too narrow and steep for pack animals, walking 15 or 20 miles a day, often barefoot or in sandals made from woven grass in conditions that would constitute a credible definition of suffering. These men left marks on the stone trails that you can still see today in parts of Sichuan and Yunnan, shallow depressions worn into the rock by centuries of the same heavy footsteps in the same places, the accumulated weight of all that tea pressing itself permanently into the landscape. Historians still argue whether the tea porter economy of the ancient roots constitutes one of the most sustained examples of physical labor in human history, or whether that distinction belongs to the camel drivers of the northern routes. What is not in dispute is that somebody's back got this tea to market, and that somebody's name was rarely recorded. Once the bricks reached the caravan assembly points, the great staging towns like Kangding in Sichuan or Dunhuang on the edge of the desert, they were repacked, loaded onto camels and mules, and the long journey westward began in earnest. The caravan was now a moving warehouse, carrying the compressed product of thousands of hours of human labor through some of the most extreme landscapes on Earth, toward markets that had been waiting for months. The road ahead was very long, and it had opinions about the people who tried to cross it. The Taklamakan Desert has a name that translates, depending on which linguist you ask, as either "you go in and you don't come out" or "place of no return," which is the kind of geographical branding that does not require a marketing department to communicate its meaning. It covers approximately 130,000 square miles of what is now the Xinjiang region of northwestern China, making it the world's second largest shifting sand desert. And it sits in the middle of the Silk Road, like a problem that cannot be avoided, only navigated around. The caravans that carried tea westward from Chang'an would have felt its presence for weeks before they reached it, the air getting drier, the vegetation thinning from scrubby grassland to scattered tamarisk and reed beds to nothing at all, the horizon flattening into a shimmer of heat and distance. To say that crossing this landscape was difficult is the kind of understatement that only becomes funny once you are safely on the other side of it. The Bactrian camels that the caravans depended on were, as previously noted, extraordinary animals, but even they required water, and the Taklamakan is defined by its lack of it. The entire strategy of the caravan, routes around and through the desert, was organized around water, specifically around the string of oasis towns fed by rivers running down from the mountains to the north and south, carrying snowmelt from the Tian Shan and Kunlun ranges into the desert basin before disappearing into the sand. Nam, Dunhuang, Turfan, Kucha, Kashgar, Khotan. These places were not simply stops on a road. They were the road. Without them, the road did not exist, and the fact that they existed at all in the middle of such extreme aridity is a testament to the peculiar hydrology of high desert systems, where mountains far away funnel their snowmelt into the earth, and it reappears, improbably, as a spring in a valley hundreds of miles distant. Turfan sits in a depression that reaches 505 feet below sea level, lower than any point in continental Asia and the second lowest place on Earth after the Dead Sea. And in summer, the surface temperature can reach 140 degrees Fahrenheit. The people of Turfan solved their water problem in one of the most ingenious ways in agricultural history. The Carez, an underground irrigation system of hand-dug tunnels that taps the water table far up in the foothills and channels it by gravity flow, running underground to prevent evaporation, emerging at the surface in the oasis settlement as a reliable and year-round supply. There are approximately 5,000 kilometers of Carez tunnels in the Turfan Basin, dug over 2,000 years by hand, maintained by communities who understood that the alternative was dying of thirst. The tea bricks passing through Turfan on camelback were, in a very real sense, floating on the labor of the people who had made this desert habitable. Life on a caravan crossing was, by any contemporary account, a sustained exercise in discomfort punctuated by occasional terror. The dust storms of the Taklamakan could appear with very little warning, a brownish smudge on the horizon that became, within minutes, a wall of sand, traveling at 60 miles an hour, that turned the air dark at midday and drove grit into every opening of the human body. Caravan leaders had developed protocols for these. The animals would be made to kneel, and the loads covered with felt or leather. The people would wrap their faces in cloth and lie down against the camel's flank and wait. Sometimes the storms lasted hours. Sometimes they lasted days. Sometimes travelers who were caught in the open without shelter were not found until the sand shifted again months later. Bandits were a separate category of problem. The Silk Road was monitored and policed by whatever empire happened to control each section of it, and the Tang dynasty at its height maintained a system of garrison towns and watchtowers along the Hexi corridor that provided reasonable security as far as Dunhuang. Beyond that, security varied considerably depending on the political conditions of the moment. During periods when the Central Asian oasis kingdoms were stable and cooperative, the road was relatively safe. During periods of fragmentation, when the Tang dynasty weakened in the 9th century, for instance, or during the upheavals of the Mongol conquests centuries later, the road became a place where a loaded caravan was a target, and the only reliable defense was size and the willingness to travel in company with others who were also armed. The merchants who organized and led these caravans were, almost without exception, not Chinese. The dominant trading people of the Silk Road from roughly the 4th to the 10th centuries AD were the Sogdians, a people from the region of what is now Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, centered on the great cities of Samarkand and Bukhara, who had developed commercial networks stretching from China to the Byzantine Empire, and who spoke multiple languages and understood multiple cultures with a fluency that made them the indispensable intermediaries of Eurasian trade. Sogdian merchant letters, actual correspondence on paper, discovered in a watchtower on the Hexi corridor and dating to around 313 AD, survive to this day and give us a vivid, immediate picture of the commercial world of the early Silk Road. They discuss prices and debts and political conditions and the difficulties of collecting payment from unreliable customers in a voice that is recognizable across 17 centuries. Commerce, it turns out, has always sounded roughly the same. The Sogdian merchant loading tea bricks onto his camels in Dunhuang knew that he was carrying something the markets to the west wanted. He knew the bricks were valuable. He did not necessarily know or care about the months of mountain labor that had produced them. What he knew was the weight and the packing and the expected selling price in Samarkand, and whether the profit margin justified the risk of the road, and what goods he might acquire in exchange to carry eastward on the return journey. Glass, perhaps, or silver, or horses, or the seeds of grapes, which China was extremely interested in acquiring for the development of its own wine production. Tea moved west in the company of everything else. Silk in bolts, ceramics wrapped in straw, spices in sealed containers, manuscripts, musical instruments, seeds, ideas. The Silk Road was not a single commodity pipeline. It was a rolling exchange of civilizations, and tea was simply the most democratic of the luxury goods it carried, because while silk could be folded away and displayed on special occasions, and jade could be locked in a cabinet. Tea had to be brewed and consumed, which meant it entered the daily life of everyone along the route who came into contact with it. By the time tea reached the oasis cities of Central Asia, Samarkand particularly, with its position at the crossroads of multiple trade routes, it was encountering cultures that had no prior knowledge of it and had to decide, essentially from scratch, what they thought of it. Some of these decisions produced fascinating results. Tibetans, as we have discussed, mixed it with yak butter and salt and created a beverage that bears approximately the same relationship to a cup of English breakfast tea as a bowl of ramen bears to a plate of plain boiled noodles. Technically the same ingredient. Completely different experience. Mongolians developed their own version with mare's milk and salt, simmered in a pot until the whole thing was thick and substantial enough to count as a meal. In Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, tea evolved into a ritual of hospitality. The offering of tea to a guest was an act with social and moral weight, a statement of welcome and safety, and the refusal of it an insult, significant enough to require explanation. These variations tell us something important about what happens when a commodity travels far from its origin. It does not arrive as itself. It arrives as potential, and what it becomes is determined by the culture that receives it. The leaf is the same, the water is the same, but the meanings layered onto the act of drinking it are entirely local, entirely human, and entirely different from place to place. Tea that started as a medicine in a Chinese mountain forest became a currency on the Tibetan plateau, became a meal in a Mongolian felt tent, became a diplomatic tool in the courts of Central Asian kings, and was still, many months and many thousands of miles of camel track later, making its way toward the west, toward the edge of the Islamic world and the courts of Persia, and eventually toward a group of European traders who were going to find it interesting in ways that nobody on the eastern end of the road had anticipated. It is worth noting before we leave the desert behind that the journey was not only physically punishing, but genuinely, statistically dangerous. Historians still argue about the mortality rate for Silk Road travelers, but contemporary sources suggest that a significant percentage of caravans lost people to the desert, to illness, to bandits, or to the mountain crossings beyond Kashgar. The passes through the Pamirs that waited on the far side of the Tarim Basin rose above 15,000 feet into a landscape of permanent ice and altitude sickness, and passes that were closed by snow for months at a time. The tea bricks that made it through had, in a very real sense, survived something. They arrived at their destinations having made a journey that most humans alive today could not make on foot under any circumstances whatsoever. You probably won't survive the Pamir crossing in December with 300 pounds of tea brick on your back, but the fact that people did regularly for 1,000 years is one of the most extraordinary things about this story. The world wanted this leaf badly enough to send people into the mountains in winter to get it, and the mountains, most of the time, eventually let them through. On the far side of the Pamir Mountains, the landscape changes in a way that feels almost personal, as if the world has decided to stop trying to kill you and start trying to impress you instead. The high, grinding passes give way to the fertile valleys of Sogdiana. The air drops to something a human body can work with without gasping, and suddenly There are rivers and orchards and cities that have been continuously inhabited for longer than Rome has existed. The first major city the westward moving caravan would reach after descending from the Pamirs was Samarkand, and Samarkand in the Tang Dynasty era was one of the most remarkable places on the surface of the planet. Its streets traded in every language spoken between the Yellow Sea and the Mediterranean. Its bazaars offered silk from China alongside glass from Alexandria, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, spices from India, furs from the northern steppe, and wool from a dozen different pastoral cultures. Its people were predominantly Sogdian, those gifted, commercially brilliant intermediaries we have already met, but its population included Persian scholars, Turkish soldiers, Indian merchants, Nestorian Christian priests, Zoroastrian firekeepers, Buddhist pilgrims, and Jewish traders who had been operating in the region since before Alexander the Great came through and admired the city so much that he married a Bactrian princess. Samarkand had been admired and conquered and rebuilt so many times by so many different peoples that it had developed a quality of cosmopolitan resilience. A city that absorbed everything and was changed by everything and remained, through all of it, absolutely itself. Into this world came the tea bricks, packed in their yak-skin wrappings, carried in on the backs of kneeling Bactrian camels in the shadow of the great blue-domed mosques and caravanserais that lined the approach to the city gates. Tea had been arriving in Central Asia in increasing quantities since the Tang dynasty turned it into a fully commercial export, and its reception in these cities was not uniformly enthusiastic. For cultures that had their own established warm beverage traditions, the various herbal infusions of the Persian world, the fermented mare's milk of the steppe peoples, the heavily spiced drinks of the Indian subcontinent, tea was something new that required an adjustment of expectation. It was less sweet than most people expected a desirable drink to be. It had a slightly astringent quality, a dryness in the mouth after swallowing that the uninitiated sometimes found puzzling rather than pleasurable. It required preparation. You couldn't simply eat it, and preparing it correctly meant boiling water and knowing the right amount and steeping it correctly, all of which was a barrier to casual adoption. And yet, it spread through Persia, through the Abbasid Caliphate that controlled much of the Middle East from the 8th century onward, through the courts of Central Asian kings and the households of merchants who had traveled east and brought the habit home with them. The Arabic word for tea, shay or chai in Persian, entered these languages and stayed, becoming a root that would eventually spread in various phonetic permutations across the entire Islamic world and into the languages of the Indian subcontinent. The word chai that you use today when you order a spiced milk tea from a coffee chain is a direct descendant of the Persian adaptation of the Chinese word cha, which itself derived from the local Yunnanese pronunciation of the character cha. Language is, among other things, a map of the trade routes that shaped it. The Islamic scholarly world of the 9th and 10th centuries had opinions about tea that were considerably more complicated than simple enthusiasm. There were genuine debates among Islamic scholars about whether tea was permissible, whether its mild stimulant properties placed it in the same category as alcohol, which was prohibited. These debates went on for some time and produced arguments of considerable sophistication, weighing the medicinal properties of the drink against its potential for intoxication, examining the hadith for relevant guidance, and generally doing what scholarly traditions do when they encounter something new and popular. They argued about it very carefully for a long time before most people agreed that it was fine. Historians still argue whether the eventual acceptance of tea in the Islamic world was driven primarily by religious scholarship or by the practical reality that by the time the scholars finished debating, everyone was already drinking it. While tea was making its philosophical journey through the Islamic world, it was simultaneously moving along a different branch of the road network, northward through the Mongolian steppe. This northern route took tea into a completely different cultural environment, the world of pastoral nomads who lived in felt tents, herded horses and cattle and sheep across the vast grasslands that stretch from Manchuria in the east to the Caspian Sea in the west, and who had a complicated and sometimes violently adversarial relationship with the Chinese agricultural civilization to their south. The Mongols' relationship with tea began long before Genghis Khan unified the steppe tribes in the early 13th century and turned the Mongol Empire into the largest contiguous land empire in human history. Mongol nomads had been receiving tea through trade and tribute for centuries, mixing it with the dairy products that were the foundation of their diet in ways that bore no resemblance to anything Lu Yu would have recognized or approved of. Mongolian sute tsai, milk tea, is made by boiling black or dark tea in water, adding large quantities of milk and seasoning with salt. Sometimes dried meat or millet is added, making it thick enough to constitute a significant meal. The tea brick, broken into chunks and thrown directly into the pot without any pretense of careful preparation, produced a robust, slightly earthy, deeply warming beverage that suited the conditions of steppe life precisely. When the Mongol Empire expanded explosively in the 13th century and eventually controlled the entire length of the Silk Road from China to Persia, a period known as the Pax Mongolica, when the road was arguably safer and more efficiently operated than at any point in its history. Tea traveled with the conquerors as well as the merchants. Mongol armies moving westward brought their tea-drinking habits into new territories, and Mongol administrators who governed China under the Yuan dynasty brought their own dietary customs into contact with the full complexity of Chinese tea culture. The result was an interesting collision. Mongol rulers who drank their tea boiled in a pot with milk and salt, governing a civilization that had spent centuries developing a philosophy of careful infusion and aesthetic appreciation. The Chinese tea ceremony, which had reached considerable heights of refinement under the Song dynasty, went into something of a decline during the Yuan period, not because the Mongols suppressed it, but because their aesthetic preferences ran in different directions. The Song dynasty had itself developed tea culture to a remarkable peak, building on the foundations Lu Yu had laid. Song dynasty tea drinkers had moved away from compressed cakes toward powdered tea, finely ground tencha, which was whisked in a bowl with a bamboo whisk into a thick frothy liquid. This is, recognizably, the ancestor of Japanese matcha, and it arrived in Japan when Buddhist monks traveled to China to study during the Tang and Song periods and brought the tea culture home with them, where it was absorbed, refined, and eventually transformed into the Japanese tea ceremony, the chado, which is one of the most elaborately codified aesthetic practices in human history. built on foundations laid in Chinese mountain gardens 2,000 years earlier. Historians still argue whether the Japanese tea ceremony represents a preservation of classical Tang and Song Chinese practice, or an original Japanese cultural creation that merely borrowed its materials from China, and both sides of the argument have compelling evidence. What concerns us more directly is the westward journey, and as tea moved through Persia and into the trading networks of the Byzantine Empire and the Arab world, it was approaching the edge of a different kind of reach. The overland Silk Road connected China to Central Asia and the Middle East with reasonable efficiency for well-organized caravans, but getting goods from the Middle East to the far western reaches of Europe, to France, to England, to the Iberian Peninsula, required either a very long overland journey through territories that were politically fragmented and often hostile, or a sea route. The sea route that would eventually carry tea to England was not yet open. The Portuguese had not yet rounded the Cape of Good Hope. The Dutch East India Company did not yet exist, and European ships had not yet found their way into the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. The world was about to change in ways that would make the old overland Silk Road look slow and limited by comparison. But the change had not yet happened. Tea was still moving at the speed of a loaded camel, 25 miles a day, through dust and mountain and desert, in the company of people who were cold and tired, and probably slightly annoyed, and who had no idea that the drink they were carrying was going to reshape the world. The road was long, the camels were persistent, and somewhere at the western end of the story, an island nation with bad weather and a deep national insecurity about beverages was waiting, without knowing it was waiting, for the most important cup of its life. Before tea could reach England, it had to reach Europe, and before it could reach Europe, someone had to find a way around the problem that had been vexing European merchants for centuries. The fact that the overland routes to Asia were long, dangerous, expensive, and controlled at their western ends by middlemen, specifically the Ottoman Empire, which after its conquest of Constantinople in 1453 sat across the land routes like a toll booth the size of a civilization. Every spice, every bolt of silk, every compressed brick of tea that made it overland to the Mediterranean had passed through Ottoman hands and acquired Ottoman markups along the way. Young European merchants, particularly the Portuguese and Spanish, began looking at their maps with the specific desperation of people who know there has to be another way in. The Portuguese found it first. Their systematic exploration of the African coastline, driven by a combination of commercial ambition and what can only be described as navigational stubbornness, culminated in 1488 when Bartolomeu Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope and demonstrated that Africa had a bottom and that you could get around it. 10 years later, Vasco da Gama took the next logical step and sailed all the way to India, arriving at Calicut in 1498 and proving definitively that you could reach the spice-producing regions of Asia by sea without negotiating with a single Ottoman official. This was, from a European commercial perspective, one of the most significant geographical facts ever established, and the Portuguese exploited it with impressive speed. Portuguese traders reached China by the early 16th century, the first Europeans to do so by the sea route, and their reports home included descriptions of the Chinese beverage made from steeped leaves that the locals called cha. These were not yet the reports of enthusiasts. The Portuguese in China were primarily interested in silk, porcelain, and the possibility of trade relationships with a civilization that turned out to be considerably less impressed by European visitors than European visitors were by it. The Ming dynasty, which governed China at this point, had a somewhat complicated attitude toward foreign merchants. They were permitted to trade, but under strict conditions, at designated ports without being allowed to move freely through the country. The Portuguese eventually established a trading presence at Macau in 1557, a small peninsula on the Chinese coast that became their commercial foothold and their window into the China trade. Tea appeared in these early Portuguese accounts as a curiosity, something the Chinese drank constantly and seemed to regard as essential, which made it noteworthy without necessarily making it desirable to a European palate trained on wine and ale. The Portuguese brought some back to Lisbon, where it was examined with the mild interest one might direct at an unfamiliar vegetable, and did not immediately transform Portuguese drinking habits. What the Portuguese had done, however, was establish the sea route and demonstrate the commercial potential of direct trade with China, which attracted the attention of every other maritime power in Europe within approximately 10 minutes of the news getting out. The Dutch were the next to arrive, and they arrived with considerably more commercial organization. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, was founded in 1602 and became, in fairly short order, one of the most powerful commercial organizations in human history. It had the legal authority to wage war, negotiate treaties, coin money, and establish colonies. It was, in effect, a sovereign state in corporate form, and it approached the Asian trade with the systematic aggression of a company that has decided it is also a navy. The VOC dominated the spice trade, fought the Portuguese for control of key trading posts, and established the Dutch as the preeminent European commercial power in Asia for much of the 17th century. The Dutch delivered the first documented shipment of tea to Europe, specifically to Amsterdam, in 1610. These were semi-regular shipments at first, small quantities treated as exotic novelties for the wealthy and the curious. By the 1640s, Dutch ships were bringing tea to Europe with some regularity, and it was appearing in the fashionable circles of Amsterdam, Paris, and the aristocratic households of the continent. Tea first arrived in Britain in the 1650s, carried by the Dutch East India Company, which was already bringing it to Paris and Holland. At this early stage, the quantities were small and the prices were extraordinary, 60 shillings per pound for the best quality, which translates to something in the region of 300 pounds in modern money, making it roughly 10 times the price of the best coffee, which gives you some sense of where tea sat in the hierarchy of luxuries. The British East India Company, the English version of the Dutch VOC, established in 1600 under a charter from Queen Elizabeth I, was slower to embrace the tea trade. The company had been focused primarily on the spice trade in India and Southeast Asia, and its operations in China were initially limited. it was importing tea to Britain from secondary markets rather than directly from China, which added cost and uncertainty to every transaction. But the company was watching the Dutch model with close attention, and it understood that direct trade with China was the key to transforming tea from an occasional luxury into a consistent commercial proposition. Meanwhile, in London, the drink was making its social debut in the most unlikely venue. The coffee house. The first London coffee house opened in 1652, and within a few years there were hundreds of them scattered across the city, each one a kind of semi-public living room where men, and it was almost exclusively men at this stage, which becomes relevant shortly, could pay a penny for admission and a cup of whatever was on offer, and spend as many hours as they liked reading newspapers, conducting business, arguing about politics, and discussing the news of the day. The coffee houses were described by contemporaries as penny universities, places where the price of admission bought you access to the information and conversation circulating through the city. Lloyd's of London, the famous insurance market, started as a coffee house. The stock exchange grew out of Jonathan's coffee house. The ideas that circulated in these places, financial, political, scientific, philosophical, shaped the intellectual and commercial culture of 17th and 18th century Britain in ways that are genuinely difficult to overstate. The first documented reference to tea in England appeared in 1658 in a newspaper advertisement for its sale at a coffee house in Sweeting's Rents in the city of London. The advertisement noted that this China drink, called by the Chinese cha, by other nations te alias tea, was available for purchase, which suggests that the drink was still sufficiently unfamiliar that it required a phonetic pronunciation guide. Thomas Garway, who ran an establishment in Exchange Alley, was one of the early coffeehouse merchants to offer tea, and he produced a broadsheet describing its supposed medicinal properties: good for the head, the stomach, the kidneys, the digestion, the eyes, and apparently almost everything else as well, in the breathless, all-encompassing language of someone who has found a product and intends to sell it. The transformation of tea from curiosity to fashionable obsession in England came largely through one woman, Catherine of Braganza, a Portuguese princess who married King Charles II in 1662 and brought with her, as part of her dowry, a chest of tea. Catherine had grown up in Portugal, where tea was more familiar than in England, and she was a committed tea drinker in a court that had not yet made up its mind about the beverage. The story goes that when she arrived in Portsmouth and was offered ale, the standard English welcome drink, she asked instead for tea, which nobody could immediately provide. Whether or not this specific exchange happened exactly as reported, what is certain is that Catherine's preference for tea was real and consistent, and that her position as queen consort gave it an immediate social authority that no amount of coffeehouse advertising could have bought. The court followed the queen's example, as courts always follow the example of whoever is setting the most fashionable precedent. Aristocratic women who were, it must be noted, not welcome in the coffeehouses that were driving tea's adoption among men, found in tea a beverage they could champion in domestic settings, in the drawing room and the parlor and the private apartments of great houses, in a social context they controlled. Tea became, in relatively short order, a marker of femininity and refinement among the upper classes, served in delicate Chinese porcelain cups imported at enormous expense alongside the tea itself, in a ritual that was deliberately aestheticized and set apart from the rougher pleasures of ale and tobacco that characterized the male coffeehouse world. The East India Company, watching this process with the commercially attuned attention of an organization that recognized a market developing in front of it, began importing tea directly to Britain in 1664. At first, the quantities were modest, a few pounds sent as a gift to the king rather than a commercial shipment, but the trajectory was clear. And within a few decades, the company was fully committed to the tea trade, importing directly from China through the port of Canton, which was the only Chinese port where European East India companies were permitted to conduct business. England had met tea. The relationship was just beginning, and like many relationships that would define a culture, it started with showing off, moved quickly through obsession, and arrived at something that looked from the outside entirely like necessity. By the early 18th century, London was a city with a tea problem, and the tea problem was this: everyone wanted it, and almost no one could legally afford it. The East India Company held a monopoly on the importation of tea to Britain, which is a commercial arrangement that tends, with the reliability of a natural law, to keep prices high and quality variable. On top of the company's own margins, the British government had been steadily increasing the duty on tea since the 1670s, adding tax upon tax in the way that governments add taxes on popular things, initially with some restraint, then with increasing confidence, then with the specific enthusiasm of an institution that has discovered a revenue stream and intends to squeeze it until something breaks. By the mid-18th century, the duty on tea had reached 119% of the import value, which is not a tax rate so much as a declaration of creative hostility toward the consumer. The result was predictable and, in retrospect, entirely avoidable: smuggling on a scale that makes the word widespread seem inadequate. By some estimates, in the middle decades of the 18th century, more than 3/4 of all the tea consumed in Britain had entered the country illegally. 3/4, meaning that the vast majority of the cups of tea being drunk in London, drawing rooms and Yorkshire farmhouses and Scottish cottages had never passed through customs, had never paid duty, and had arrived on British shores via a network of Dutch and Scandinavian ships standing offshore in the dark, while small, fast vessels rowed out to meet them and transferred the cargo in the kind of organized, business-like midnight operation that only works because the local justice of the peace is a regular customer and has agreed not to notice. The smuggling networks were not small-time operations run by a few enterprising fishermen. They were sophisticated commercial enterprises with their own supply chains, financing arrangements, storage facilities, and distribution networks. The Hawkhurst gang, operating out of Kent and Sussex in the 1730s and 1740s, was one of the most notorious of violent and well-organized smuggling operation that controlled much of the southeast English coast and was not above using murder to protect its business interests. They stored contraband tea in the crypts of churches, in the cellars of respectable households, in barns and haystacks and the back rooms of inns, moving it inland on pack horses in the small hours of the morning, with a confidence that came from knowing that the entire community, from the vicar to the magistrate, was implicated in the trade. The smuggled tea itself was not always what it purported to be. Alongside the genuine Chinese tea that came in via Dutch and Scandinavian East India companies, which had been specifically established in part to supply the British black market with the majority of their commercial income derived from selling tea to English smugglers, there was a roaring trade in adulterated and counterfeit tea. Used tea leaves, dried and recolored with copper compounds, iron sulfate, or sheep's dung, were sold as fresh. Leaves from English hedgerow plants, sloe, elder, hawthorn, were dried and blended with genuine tea to extend volume. Sawdust, clay, and various other substances were added as bulking agents. The result was a product that tasted unreliable at best and mildly toxic at worst, and which bore the same relationship to good Chinese tea that a gas station sandwich bears to a proper meal. The government's response to all of this was, for decades, the wrong response. They kept raising the tax, which kept driving people to the smugglers, which kept reducing the legitimate revenue, which prompted more tax rises in a spiral of policy making that suggests nobody in the relevant ministry had ever heard of the concept of unintended consequences. The East India Company, meanwhile, found itself sitting on enormous warehouses full of tea it could not sell legally at a price anyone would pay, while the black market operated openly in the very streets outside its offices. The situation became politically untenable in several directions simultaneously. Most famously, the company's attempt to solve its surplus problem by dumping cheap, but still taxed, tea on the American colonies produced the Boston Tea Party of December 1773. When a group of colonists organized by the Sons of Liberty boarded 3 East India Company ships in Boston Harbor and threw 342 chests of tea into the water in a demonstration of political principle that was also, incidentally, an enormous waste of perfectly good bohea. The tea that landed in Boston Harbor was mostly loose black tea, originally imported from China and then sitting in company warehouses, and the event it triggered a chain of colonial grievances and British overreactions that led directly to the American Revolutionary War, is perhaps the most dramatic demonstration in history of what happens when you tax a beverage too aggressively. Meanwhile, back in Britain, the solution was eventually found not in the colonies, but in a meeting between a young prime minister and a tea merchant. William Pitt the Younger became prime minister in December 1783 at the age of 24, which remains the youngest age at which anyone has held that office in British history, and which gave him the combination of confidence and inexperience that sometimes produces genuinely radical policy decisions. On the advice of Richard Twining of the Twinings Tea Company, whose family had been selling tea in London since Thomas Twining opened his shop on the Strand in 1706, Pitt introduced the Commutation Act of 1784, which in a single stroke reduced the duty on tea from 119% to 12.5%. The effect was immediate and almost comically complete. Smuggling ceased to be economically viable essentially overnight because the price of legal tea dropped below the price of smuggled tea, removing the entire commercial rationale for the black market in a single legislative move. Legal tea imports exploded. In 1784, retained imports stood at approximately 5 million pounds weight. In 1785, they rose to over 16 million pounds, a more than threefold increase in a single year. This was not new demand being created. It was existing demand being redirected from illegal to legal channels, revealing the true scale of consumption that the high-tax regime had been obscuring. The government, despite the lower rate, actually collected more revenue from tea than before, because the volume increase more than compensated for the rate reduction, a principle that tax theorists call the Laffer curve, and that Pitt appears to have understood intuitively at 25 years old, which is either impressive or annoying, depending on your perspective. The Commutation Act transformed tea in Britain from a luxury commodity into a mass market product with the speed of a policy decision that for once actually worked. Prices fell, quality improved, because legitimate merchants importing through proper channels had reputations to protect. The adulterated hedgerow blends and sheep's dung-colored used leaves that had passed for tea in the smuggling era were gradually displaced by actual Chinese tea of consistent quality, and as prices fell and quality rose, the market expanded downward through the social classes, from the aristocratic drawing rooms where Catherine of Braganza had made it fashionable, through the middling classes of merchants and professionals, and eventually into the homes of working people, the factory workers and miners and textile mill employees, who would, in a few more decades, form the backbone of an industrialized Britain that ran, to a remarkable degree, on tea. The East India Company's position in all of this was both powerful and increasingly complicated. It held its monopoly on direct trade with China, purchasing tea at Canton, the only port open to European traders, loading it onto its large, sturdy East Indiaman ships, and carrying it back to London for auction at its warehouses. Between 1720 and 1750, tea imports through the company had more than quadrupled. By 1757, the company was importing approximately 12 million pounds of tea per year, with another 17 million pounds sitting in its warehouses. By the 1780s, European demand for tea had reached 9.4 million kilograms annually. These numbers represent an extraordinary commercial achievement, but they also represent a structural problem. The company was buying tea from China and paying for it in silver, because China, at this period, was not particularly interested in British manufactured goods, and the only currency the Chinese trading houses at Canton would reliably accept was silver. This meant that the company was continuously draining silver out of the British economy and into China in exchange for tea, silk, and porcelain, creating a trade imbalance that concerned British economists and government ministers in the way that large, one-directional flows of precious metal tend to concern people who think about these things for a living. The company tried various solutions, attempting to sell British woolens in China, which the Chinese found uninspiring, and Indian cotton, which was marginally more successful, before arriving at a solution that was effective, profitable, and catastrophically harmful: opium. Opium was grown in Bengal under company supervision. It was sold to private merchants who shipped it illegally into China. The Qing government had prohibited its import in exchange for silver, which then flowed back to the company's trading operations in Canton to purchase more tea. The system worked, in a narrow commercial sense, with appalling efficiency. It also created a massive addiction crisis in China, with millions of people dependent on the drug, weakening the population and draining Chinese silver reserves in the opposite direction from before, when the Chinese government under the Daoguang Emperor attempted to stop the trade by confiscating and destroying 20,000 chests of opium at Canton in 1839. Britain went to war twice. The First Opium War from 1839 to 1842 and the Second Opium War from 1856 to 1860 ended in humiliating Chinese defeats and the forced opening of Chinese ports to foreign trade. Hong Kong ceded to Britain, 5 treaty ports opened, and a relaxation of restrictions that had previously limited where European merchants could operate. This was, in the brutal arithmetic of imperial history, the price that China paid for Britain's tea habit, a fact that tends to produce a moment of uncomfortable silence when mentioned at an afternoon tea. The tea kept flowing westward, the boats got faster, and on the docks of London the people were waiting. Stand on the docks of the Thames in the early 19th century, and the smell hits you before anything else. Tar and salt and fish, and the particular dense organic richness of a working river that has absorbed decades of commerce into its mud. The wharves stretch east from the city of London in a tangle of cranes and warehouses and moored vessels, their masts so thick along the waterfront that from a distance they look like a leafless winter forest. Thousands of spars pointing at the gray London sky. Somewhere in that forest of ships, unloading with the ponderous efficiency of large organizations that have been doing the same thing for a long time, are the East Indiamen, great, broad-beamed cargo ships, each one carrying the product of months at sea and thousands of miles of ocean, their holds stacked with tea chests, bound in lead and wooden planking to protect the leaves from moisture and the smell of the bilges. The East Indiamen were not beautiful ships. They were not built for speed or elegance or the particular kind of nautical romance that later generations would project onto the era of sail. They were built for capacity and durability, for carrying enormous quantities of cargo through the storms of the Cape of Good Hope and the monsoon seas of the Indian Ocean, returning profit to the company's shareholders over a working life of a decade or more. A single East Indiaman might carry anywhere from 500 to over 1,000 tons of cargo. The voyage from Canton to London took somewhere between 5 and 13 months, depending on the season, the winds, the route taken, and the competence of the captain, and the conditions on board were, by all contemporary accounts, somewhere between uncomfortable and genuinely terrible. The tea was packed in wooden chests, typically made from softwood or bamboo, lined with lead foil or tin to prevent moisture penetration, packed tightly with the compressed or loose leaf, and then sealed. The chests were loaded into the hold with great care, stacked and wedged to prevent movement at sea, because shifting cargo in heavy weather was one of the more reliable ways to lose a ship. A large East Indiaman might carry 10,000 chests of tea on a single voyage, which represented an investment of many thousands of pounds and the commercial expectations of a substantial number of people in London who were waiting to profit from it. The journey from Canton, or later from the treaty ports opened after the Opium Wars, including Fuzhou on the Min River, which became the primary loading port for the finest teas, began with the annual monsoon cycle that governed all movement in the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean. The timing of departure was not a commercial decision so much as a meteorological one. You left when the winds allowed. You rounded the Cape when the Southern Ocean was in a relatively cooperative mood, and you arrived in the Thames whenever you arrived. The unpredictability of this schedule, combined with the long duration of the voyage, meant that tea arriving from China might be anywhere from 6 months to well over a year old by the time it reached London's auction houses. For black teas, which had been processed and dried to a low moisture content and packed in sealed chests, this was acceptable. The flavor survived the journey with some loss of brightness, but without fundamental degradation. For green teas, which were more delicate and more susceptible to moisture and temperature changes, the journey was considerably harder on the product. This practical reality, that black tea survived the sea voyage better than green tea, had a significant effect on British tea culture. It is one of the main reasons why Britain became a nation of black tea drinkers, while China, Japan, and much of East Asia maintained strong traditions of green tea consumption. The logistics of the trade route shaped the taste of the destination market, quite literally determining what kind of tea the British palate would learn to prefer. By the time green tea could have been reliably imported in good condition, which required faster ships, the British preference for robust, malty, full-bodied black teas was already so deeply established that it was effectively cultural identity rather than mere habit. Tea was sold at auction at the East India Company's warehouses in the City of London at regular quarterly sales that were major commercial events drawing buyers from across the country. The company maintained vast storage facilities. By the early 19th century, its warehouses held many millions of pounds of tea in reserve, and the auctions set the prices that would flow through the entire supply chain, from the London wholesaler to the provincial grocer to the consumer, who would eventually brew it in a kitchen in Manchester or Edinburgh or Bristol. The system was efficient in some respects and deeply monopolistic in others, and the monopoly was the thing that eventually broke it. In 1834, the East India Company lost its monopoly on trade with China, which was abolished by an Act of Parliament that reflected the growing influence of free trade ideology in British politics. The end of the monopoly meant, in principle, that any merchant with sufficient capital and a suitable ship could now enter the China tea trade. In practice, it meant that the market was about to be transformed by competition in ways that nobody had fully anticipated, and the most dramatic expression of that transformation would be the clipper ship. The clippers that emerged from British and American shipyards in the 1840s and 1850s were unlike any commercial vessel that had existed before them. Where the East Indiamen were broad and heavy and built for capacity, the clippers were narrow and tall and built entirely for speed. Their hulls were designed with sharp bows that cut through the water rather than displacing it, the lines flowing back to a narrow stern in a shape that drew on every advance in naval architecture accumulated over 2 centuries of ocean sailing. Their masts were extraordinarily tall. The mainmast of the Cudi Sark, built in Dumbarton, Scotland, in 1869, rose 153 feet above the deck, and they carried a vast area of sail on multiple yards, arranged to catch the maximum wind from every angle. The Cudi Sark carried 32,000 square feet of sail when fully set, spread across 11 miles of rigging, and in favorable conditions could sustain speeds that the old East Indiamen could not have achieved even briefly. The first true tea clipper, Rainbow, was designed by American naval architect John Griffiths and launched in 1845, making the voyage from New York to Canton in 102 days and cutting more than 2 weeks off the previous record. The American clippers that followed were initially faster than anything the British could produce, and in 1850 the American China packet Oriental made the journey from Hong Kong to London in 99 days, a passage so remarkable that British shipbuilders immediately contracted her, paying her significantly above the standard freight rate, and then went home to their drawing boards with the specific motivation of people who have just been publicly embarrassed in their own area of professional expertise. Within a few years, the British yards were producing clippers that matched and eventually surpassed the Americans, and the tea trade had been transformed from a slow, reliable, monopolistic operation into something closer to a sporting event. The incentive driving this transformation was the premium, an extra payment written into the bills of lading for the first ship to arrive in London each season with a cargo of the new tea. This premium, typically around 10 shillings per ton by 1861, sounds modest until you multiply it across a full cargo of tea and add the reputational value of being known as the fastest ship in the trade, which allowed a clipper's owners to negotiate better freight rates for subsequent voyages. The fashion in Victorian Britain for fresh tea, specifically the first new season tea to arrive in London with the cachet of having just made the fastest possible crossing, created a market dynamic that turned the annual tea races into events of genuine public interest. Newspapers ran shipping intelligence columns tracking the progress of clippers from their departure at Fuzhou or Shanghai. Bets were placed in London coffee houses, in Hong Kong counting houses, among the officers of the competing ships themselves. When a fast clipper was sighted off the English coast, word traveled ahead of it, and a crowd would gather at the docks. The most celebrated of all the tea races was the Great Tea Race of 1866, in which 16 of the finest clippers assembled at the pagoda anchorage on the Min River near Fuzhou in late May and loaded with the new season's tea in an atmosphere of barely contained competitive excitement. The principal contenders were 5 ships: Ariel, Taiping, Fiery Cross, Sarika, and Taitzing. Ariel, launched in 1865 and widely regarded as the fastest clipper of her day, was built of composite construction, wooden planking on an iron skeleton. At Robert Steele's yard in Greenock on the Clyde, measuring approximately 195 feet in length with a beam of 34 feet, designed specifically for performance in the light winds that characterized parts of the China Sea Passage. The 5 ships departed within a 24-hour window and then disappeared into the East China Sea, beginning a race of 12,000 to 14,000 nautical miles that would carry them south through the Sunda Strait, between Java and Sumatra, across the Indian Ocean, around the Cape of Good Hope, north through the Atlantic, and up the English Channel to the Thames, a route that took them through typhoon season, through the doldrums, through the fierce and unpredictable weather of the Southern Ocean, and finally through the crowded shipping lanes of the Channel approaches, where the first pilot boat to come alongside a vessel and put a river pilot aboard effectively marked the end of the race. After 99 days at sea, covering roughly 14,000 nautical miles, Ariel and Taping arrived at the mouth of the Thames within minutes of each other, having been essentially neck and neck for the final days of the passage. Taping docked 20 minutes ahead of Ariel, but Ariel had taken on her river pilot first, and the technicalities of who actually won were sufficiently complicated that the premium was eventually split between them. Sarika arrived later the same day, only hours behind. 3 ships separated by a matter of hours after 3 months and 14,000 miles of ocean, having left China within a day of each other. It was the closest finish the tea races ever produced, and it generated press coverage of a kind more typically associated today with a championship sporting final. The era of the Clipper was glorious and brief. The Suez Canal opened in 1869, the same week the Cutty Sark was launched, reducing the journey between Britain and China by approximately 3,000 miles, and giving steam-powered ships which could use the canal, while sailing vessels could not, an insurmountable advantage in journey time. Within a decade of the canal's opening, the steam-powered tea trade had essentially displaced the sailing clippers, which were repurposed to lower-value routes, wool from Australia, grain from California, that did not require the same premium on speed. The Cutty Sark completed 8 voyages to China before being redirected to the Australian wool trade, where she continued to demonstrate that she was an extraordinary vessel, just not quite in the role she had been built for. The romance of the tea clippers lasted barely 25 years in their prime, but in those 25 years, they had transformed the relationship between Britain and its tea in ways that went beyond the commercial. They had made tea fast. They had made it dramatic. They had given a nation that drank the stuff twice a day something to watch and cheer for, which is perhaps the most British possible relationship with a beverage. While clipper ships were racing each other down the Atlantic and merchants in London were placing bets on which captain would arrive first with the season's new tea, something equally significant was happening in the kitchens, parlors, factories, and drawing rooms of Britain itself. Tea was not merely being imported in ever-increasing quantities. It was being absorbed slowly, completely, and with the kind of thoroughness that transforms a foreign import into something that feels, eventually, like it was always there. The story of how tea became British is, in some ways, more interesting than the story of how it arrived, because it involves class anxiety, government overreach, industrial revolution, women's liberation, and a duchess who was hungry at 4 in the afternoon. Let us start with the working people, because it is their adoption of tea that truly cemented its place in British culture, and because their story is told less often than the story of the aristocrats and merchants who got there first. By the middle of the 18th century, Britain was in the early stages of a transformation that would, within a century, make it the most industrialized nation on earth. Mills and factories were appearing in the north of England, in Lancashire and Yorkshire and the Midlands, drawing people off the land and into urban manufacturing work at a pace that the existing social and physical infrastructure could barely accommodate. The cities grew faster than the housing stock. Working conditions in the early factories were brutal by any measure, 12 to 14-hour shifts, 6 days a week, in buildings filled with cotton dust or coal smoke, or the noise of machinery at a volume that caused permanent hearing damage over years of exposure. The Factory Acts of 1833 formalized rest periods, the first legal recognition that workers were entitled to stop working occasionally. But the basic conditions remained grueling for decades. Tea fitted into this world with a practicality that no amount of aristocratic fashion could have engineered deliberately. It was hot, which was warming in the cold and damp of a northern English morning. It was stimulating, providing a caffeine boost that helped maintain alertness through long shifts in a way that the ale it partially replaced absolutely did not. It was cheap enough after the Commutation Act of 1784 slashed the duty and made smuggled tea redundant to be within reach of working-class budgets. It could be prepared quickly and with minimal equipment, a kettle, a pot, a cup. It required no cooking skill. It could be made in a factory break room or a back kitchen with equal ease. It could be drunk with a piece of bread or a biscuit and constitute something that at least approximated a meal break. And crucially, it was safe to drink in a way that the water in most British industrial cities emphatically was not. This last point deserves emphasis. The water supply of 19th century British industrial cities was, to put it charitably, a public health catastrophe. Rivers and wells contaminated by sewage, industrial runoff, and the accumulated waste of overcrowded urban populations were the primary cause of the cholera epidemics that periodically swept through cities like Manchester and London and Leeds, killing thousands in a matter of weeks. People who boiled their water before drinking it, which making tea required, were, without knowing the bacteriological reason, effectively protecting themselves from waterborne disease. The connection between tea drinking and improved public health was not understood in mechanistic terms at the time, but the practical reality was that communities that adopted tea as their primary beverage tended to be healthier than those that didn't, which provided an unconscious reinforcement of the habit that went well beyond taste preference. By the early 19th century, working families in Britain were consuming tea twice daily as a matter of absolute routine. It was no longer a luxury. It was no longer a fashion. It was a necessity, as fundamental to the daily rhythm of working life as the shift bell or the walk to the factory gates. The historian's question of exactly when tea crossed the line from imported novelty to national staple does not have a clean answer. It was a gradual process spanning decades. But by around the 1820s, the transformation was essentially complete. Britain had a strong identity as a tea-drinking nation, and the identity was held equally by the duchess in her drawing room and the weaver at her loom. The temperance movement of the 19th century accelerated this process considerably. The campaign against alcohol that gathered momentum from the 1830s onward saw tea as the ideal alternative to the gin and beer that reformers blamed for a substantial portion of the social problems of industrial Britain. Temperance campaigners promoted tea with evangelical fervor, establishing tea rooms as alcohol-free social spaces, distributing pamphlets about the virtues of the beverage, and organizing events, tea meetings, temperance teas, tea parties of a specifically moral character that positioned a cup of tea as a form of social virtue as well as physical refreshment. Historians still argue whether the temperance movement's promotion of tea had a significant independent effect on consumption, or whether it was simply swimming with a tide that was already moving strongly in that direction regardless. The physical spaces in which tea was consumed also evolved dramatically during this period. The coffee house, which had been the primary venue for tea drinking outside the home in the 17th and early 18th centuries, was a male-dominated space in which women were not welcome as customers. This exclusion had the unintended effect of making the domestic consumption of tea in the home in settings that women controlled a specifically feminine domain, reinforcing the association between tea and the private, refined, feminine sphere of Georgian and Victorian social life. When tea shops began to appear in the early 18th century, Thomas Twining opened his famous tea shop at 216 Strand in London around 1706, where it still operates today, making it one of the oldest retail businesses in Britain. They offered something the coffee houses did not: a respectable public space where women could purchase and consume tea without social censure. The Aerated Bread Company, which opened tea rooms across Britain from the 1860s onward, took this a step further, creating a network of clean, respectable, affordable tea rooms that were explicitly welcoming to women traveling alone or in small groups, shoppers, working women, ladies on errands in the city, and in doing so created something new in British urban life, a public social space that was neither a pub nor a domestic interior, where women could sit, rest, and take refreshment without a male escort. The tea room was, among other things, a small but genuine step in the social emancipation of British women, and it happened because tea existed. Now we must talk about the Duchess. Anna Maria Russell, the 7th Duchess of Bedford, was a lifelong friend of Queen Victoria and one of her ladies of the bedchamber between 1837 and 1841. She was also, by her own account, someone who suffered a persistent and unacceptable sinking feeling around 4 or 5 in the afternoon, which she attributed to the long gap between the light lunch served at midday and the increasingly late dinner that fashionable Victorian society was pushing toward 8 or 9 in the evening. The industrialization and urbanization of Britain, combined with the spread of gaslighting that freed the wealthy classes from the tyranny of sunset, had gradually shifted dinner later and later among those who could afford the candles and the company. The gap between meals had become, for the Duchess, intolerable. Her solution, developed around 1840 during a visit to Belvoir Castle as the guest of the Duke of Rutland, was to request a tray of tea, bread and butter, and small cakes be brought to her rooms in the mid-afternoon. She then began inviting friends to join her, expanding the private snack into a small social occasion. When she returned to London and continued the practice in her home's blue drawing room at Woburn Abbey, it spread quickly through the aristocratic circles she inhabited, becoming fashionable with the speed that social customs adopt when they fill a genuine need and have a prominent enough champion. Afternoon tea, served between 3 and 5 in the afternoon, with small sandwiches, scones with clotted cream and jam, and a selection of small cakes, all accompanied by a pot of good tea poured into fine china cups, became one of the most elaborately codified rituals in British social life, with a speed that still seems remarkable. Within a generation of the Duchess's initial innovation, it had developed its own grammar of etiquette, which way to hold the cup, how to eat a scone without embarrassing yourself or your host, the correct way to pour, whether milk goes in before or after the tea, a debate that has never been resolved and presumably never will be, which is one of the great continuing achievements of British cultural stubbornness. The milk question, incidentally, has an origin more practical than aesthetic. Early fine porcelain teacups were susceptible to cracking when hot liquid was poured directly into them, and adding cold milk first tempered the temperature shock. As the quality of porcelain improved and the risk of cracking diminished, the milk-first habit persisted in some households and the tea-first habit in others, and the division calcified into something people have strong opinions about without being entirely sure why. High tea, which sounds posher than afternoon tea, but is in fact the opposite, developed in parallel among the working classes as a hearty early evening meal eaten when workers came home from the factories or fields, typically consisting of cold meats, cheeses, bread, pies, and baked beans, accompanied by a strong pot of tea and eaten at the high dining table rather than the low occasional tables of the aristocratic drawing room. The terms high and low refer to the table height, not the social register. This distinction is one of the more satisfying pieces of class inversion in British social history, and it confuses foreign visitors at a rate that suggests it may be maintained deliberately. By the mid-Victorian period, tea had completed its remarkable journey from a leaf in a Chinese mountain forest to the absolute center of British daily life, woven into the social fabric at every level, from the monarch's table to the factory floor, from the Duchess's blue drawing room to the miner's kitchen. It had survived taxation, smuggling, adulteration, political crisis, and 2 wars fought in its service. It had crossed deserts on camelback and oceans in the holds of racing ships. It had changed the culture of an island nation so thoroughly that the British themselves, when asked to identify their national characteristics, would list tea drinking without hesitation or irony, alongside fair play and the particular stoic cheerfulness of a people who have spent centuries making the best of circumstances they cannot change. The leaf had arrived, and it was staying. There is a moment that happens in the history of any commodity that becomes truly essential to a civilization, when the civilization stops being able to imagine life without it and starts actively panicking about the security of its supply. Britain reached that moment with tea sometime in the early 19th century, when it became clear that the entire national tea habit was dependent on a single source, China, accessible through a single trading company, the East India Company, operating through a single port, Canton, under conditions set entirely by a foreign government that had its own ideas about how much access European merchants should have to Chinese markets and what they should pay for the privilege. This was not, from a British imperial perspective, a comfortable arrangement. The anxiety was reasonable. China in the early 19th century was not a reliable commercial partner in the way that British merchants preferred their commercial partners to be reliable. The Qing dynasty, which had governed China since 1644, operated the Canton trading system, the only legal channel for European tea imports, through a group of licensed Chinese merchant firms called the Kohong, who held a monopoly on dealings with foreign traders and operated under rules that restricted Europeans to a specific area of Canton's waterfront, prohibited them from learning the Chinese language, forbade them from moving freely through the country, and generally made clear that the Chinese Empire regarded European merchants as a useful but not particularly prestigious category of visitor. The British found this attitude simultaneously insulting and commercially inconvenient, which is a combination that tends in imperial history to eventually produce gunboats. But before the gunboats arrived, and we have already discussed the Opium Wars and their consequences in the context of the tea trade, there was a different British response to the supply anxiety, one that was quieter and more patient and ultimately more consequential for the global tea industry than any military victory. The British decided to grow their own. The idea of cultivating tea outside China had been circulating in British commercial and scientific circles since the late 18th century, when the botanical dimensions of the East India trade began to intersect with the growing British enthusiasm for plant collection and horticultural science. The challenge was both botanical and geographical. You needed the right plant, the right soil, the right climate, and the right knowledge of how to process the leaves once harvested. And all of these things existed in China under conditions of deliberate secrecy. The Chinese were well aware that their monopoly on tea production was a commercial advantage of enormous value, and they guarded the knowledge of cultivation and processing with considerable care. Foreign merchants at Canton were not permitted to visit tea gardens. The process by which leaves were transformed into the finished product was not publicly documented in any form accessible to outsiders. The botanical identity of the tea plant itself was, for a period, genuinely uncertain among Western scientists. The first breakthrough came, appropriately enough, from India. In 1823, a Scottish explorer and adventurer named Robert Bruce was traveling through the Assam region of northeastern India when he encountered local Singpho people who were using the leaves of a plant to make a drink. Bruce recognized the plant as a tea variety, Camellia sinensis variety assamica, a larger leafed variety than the Chinese type, growing wild in the forests of Assam at lower elevations and warmer temperatures than the Chinese mountain gardens. He collected samples, but died before he could formally document his discovery. His brother Charles pursued the botanical identification, and by 1839, the Assam Company had been established to develop the commercial cultivation of Indian tea. The early years of Indian tea cultivation were not smooth. The British initially underestimated the wild Assam plants and attempted to establish tea gardens using Chinese seeds and Chinese plants, imported with considerable difficulty, which struggled in the different soil and climate conditions of northeastern India. The Chinese processing techniques, reconstructed partly from observation and partly from texts, produced inconsistent results. The labor required to cultivate and harvest on a commercial scale was sourced through systems of indentured labor that were, in practice, barely distinguishable from coercion. Workers recruited from distant regions of India with contracts they could not read, transported to remote plantations in the Assam jungle, and held to terms that gave them very little practical freedom. This aspect of the Indian tea industry's founding is not a comfortable footnote. It is a central structural feature, and historians who study the labor history of the tea gardens document conditions that the industry's commercial beneficiaries in Britain preferred not to examine too closely. The more celebrated chapter of the British campaign to break China's tea monopoly involves a man who combined the talents of botanist, spy, linguist, and horticultural thief in proportions that would seem implausible in a novel. Robert Fortune. Fortune was a Scottish botanist employed by the Royal Horticultural Society who made his first journey to China in 1843. Immediately after the treaty ports were opened following the First Opium War, and spent 3 years collecting plants and observing the tea districts of the Zhejiang and Fujian provinces with the specific brief of bringing back anything useful. He disguised himself as a Chinese merchant, shaving the front of his head, wearing Chinese clothes, and adopting a Mandarin accent that apparently convinced most people he met, though the logistics of this deception seem more impressive the longer you think about them, and traveled into the interior of China, visiting tea gardens and processing workshops that no foreigner had seen before. On his second and more audacious journey in 1848, Fortune was sent by the East India Company with an explicit mission to obtain the best tea plants and seeds from China's finest growing regions and transport them to the company's experimental gardens in India, along with, crucially, skilled Chinese tea workers who could teach the Indians how to process the leaves correctly. He managed all of this. He shipped approximately 20,000 young tea plants and 17,000 seedlings from China's finest growing districts to India, packed in the Wardian cases, sealed glass containers that maintained humidity during the voyage, that had been developed specifically for the long-distance transport of live plants. He also recruited 8 Chinese tea specialists who made the journey to India and spent time teaching the workers on the Himalayan tea estates the processing techniques they had learned in Fujian and Zhejiang. The tea plants that Fortune carried to India were destined for the Himalayan foothills of Darjeeling, Assam, and the Nilgiri hills of southern India, regions where the altitude, rainfall, temperature range, and soil chemistry created growing conditions that proved over the following decades to be not merely adequate for tea production, but genuinely exceptional. Darjeeling tea, grown at elevations between 6,000 and 8,000 feet in the foothills of the Himalayas, developed a flavor profile unlike anything produced in China, a delicate, slightly muscatel quality that tea traders called the Darjeeling muscatel, caused by the feeding activity of a small leafhopper insect that damages the leaves and triggers a chemical defense response that produces uniquely aromatic compounds. Nature, as it so often does, found a way to make the stress productive. By the 1860s and 1870s, Indian tea production was growing rapidly, and by the 1880s, India had overtaken China as the primary source of tea for the British market. This was a commercial revolution of enormous significance. It meant that the British tea supply was now largely under British imperial control, grown on British-administered territory, processed by workers who were, at least theoretically, subject to British labor regulations, however poorly enforced, and shipped in British vessels to British ports without passing through Chinese customs or Ottoman middlemen, or any of the other intermediaries that had complicated the trade for 2 centuries. It also meant that the tea arriving in British cups was fundamentally different from what had been arriving them before. Stronger, more robust, better suited to the British preference for a full, dark brew that could stand up to milk and still taste like something which was itself a preference shaped by the characteristics of the black teas that had survived the China voyage and were now being replicated deliberately in Indian growing conditions. Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka, entered the tea story through a catastrophe. The island had been primarily a coffee-producing colony until the 1870s, when a fungal disease called Himalaya vastatrix swept through the coffee plantations with devastating completeness, destroying virtually the entire crop in a matter of years. The colonial response was to switch to tea, which proved so well suited to Ceylon's combination of altitude, rainfall, and temperature that within 20 years the island was producing some of the finest tea in the world. Ceylon tea, lighter than Assam, brighter than Darjeeling, with a clean, brisk quality that made it excellent for blending, became a cornerstone of the British tea trade and the foundation of brands that survive to this day. The development of blended teas, combining leaves from different origins to produce a consistent, reproducible flavor profile that could be sold under a brand name year after year, was itself a commercial innovation of considerable importance. John Horniman had introduced individually packaged sealed tea in 1826, replacing the loose tea sold by the scoop from open containers that were susceptible to adulteration and moisture. Thomas Lipton, the Glasgow-born entrepreneur who bought tea estates directly in Ceylon and built a retail empire that sold tea from plantation to teacup, with the vertical integration of a man who has identified every point where someone else was making a profit and decided to capture it himself, transformed tea retail in the 1880s and 1890s with low prices, consistent quality, and aggressive advertising. Lipton's signature blend, sold in sealed packets at a price point accessible to working-class consumers, was not the most sophisticated tea ever produced. It was the right tea at the right price at the right moment, which in commercial terms is usually more important. The tea that had started its journey in a Yunnan mountain forest as a medicine traveled the Silk Road as a compressed brick on camelback, crossed the ocean in the hold of a racing clipper, and been taxed and smuggled and argued over and fought for across centuries and continents, had arrived at its final destination, a sealed paper packet on a grocer's shelf in a British high street, retailing for a price that even the most modest household could manage. The journey had taken, depending on how you measured it, somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 years. The cup of tea it produced was hot and strong and slightly bitter and absolutely perfect with milk. The leaf had found its island, the island had found its leaf, and neither of them would ever quite be the same again. Pull your blanket a little closer. We have been traveling for a long time, across mountains and deserts and oceans, through courts and caravanserais and London dockhouses. And it is worth pausing now in the quieter middle distance of the story to think about what tea actually is when you strip away the history and the commerce and the imperial politics and hold it up to the light by itself. What is in this leaf that made the world want it so badly? What is happening in that cup that justified camels and clipper ships and 2 wars and a legislative overhaul and the systematic industrial espionage of an entire nation's botanical secrets? The answer begins with chemistry, because everything that tea does to the human body begins with the compounds the Camellia sinensis plant produces in its leaves, and those compounds are extraordinary in both their variety and their interactions with human physiology. The most famous of these compounds is caffeine, and tea contains it in quantities that vary considerably depending on the type of leaf, the position on the plant, the time of year, and the processing method. The youngest leaves, the bud and first leaf, the most tender and most prized, contain the highest concentrations of caffeine because the plant uses the alkaloid as a natural pesticide, concentrating it where the tissue is most vulnerable and most worth protecting. A cup of black tea typically contains somewhere between 40 and 70 milligrams of caffeine, compared to 80 to 100 milligrams in typical cup of coffee, enough to produce a noticeable lift in alertness and mood without the sharp spike and subsequent crash that higher doses tend to produce. This mild stimulation was recognized and valued from the earliest documented uses of tea in China, and it is a large part of why tea spread so successfully through populations engaged in work that required sustained mental or physical effort. But caffeine alone does not explain the quality of the tea experience, and this is where the chemistry becomes genuinely interesting. Tea also contains an amino acid called L-theanine, found almost exclusively in the tea plant and in very few other organisms in nature. L-theanine crosses the blood-brain barrier and promotes the production of alpha brain waves, the neural activity associated with a state of relaxed alertness, the mental space in which you are calm but not drowsy, focused but not tense. The interaction between L-theanine and caffeine in tea produces a combined effect that is qualitatively different from caffeine alone. The stimulation is smoother, more sustained, and accompanied by a quality of calm concentration that coffee, with its higher caffeine and minimal L-theanine, tends not to produce. This specific neurological effect, calm alertness, focused tranquility, is almost certainly the quality that Lu Yu was gesturing at when he described tea as a pathway to inner serenity, and that Tibetan monks valued for meditation, and that British factory workers found helped them get through a 14-hour shift with their minds intact. The polyphenols in tea, a large group of plant compounds that includes the catechins that give green tea its slightly grassy, astringent character, and the theaflavins and theorubigins that develop during oxidation and give black tea its rich, dark color and malty flavor, are the compounds most studied for their potential health effects, and the research here is genuinely interesting, even if it requires some caution about overclaiming. The antioxidant properties of tea polyphenols are well established in laboratory conditions. Their effects in the human body are more complex and variable, and the epidemiological studies that have examined the health outcomes of tea drinking populations have produced results that are suggestive and intriguing, but not definitive. What is clear is that the belief in tea's health benefits, present from the earliest Chinese medicinal uses, documented enthusiastically by Thomas Garway's 17th century broadsheet, promoted by the temperance movement, and alive and well in the 21st century supplement industry. has consistently run slightly ahead of the scientific evidence, which is perhaps a tribute to the placebo effect as much as anything else. The flavor of tea, the thing that makes it pleasurable to drink quite apart from its physiological effects, is produced by a remarkable number of chemical compounds working in concert. Over 600 different volatile aromatic compounds have been identified in tea, contributing to the flavor profiles that distinguish Darjeeling from Assam, Yunnan from Fujian, green from black from oolong. These compounds are affected by every stage of the tea's production: the soil in which the plant grew, the altitude and temperature and rainfall of the growing region, the timing of the harvest within the season, the specific processing techniques applied after picking, the temperature and timing of the firing, the moisture content of the finished product, the conditions of storage and transport, the temperature of the water used for brewing, and the duration of the steep. This sensitivity to conditions is part of what makes tea a craft as well as a commodity. The difference between a mediocre cup and an excellent one is real and significant, and it is not determined by price alone, but by attention. Attention at every stage, from the garden to the cup, the accumulated care of dozens of people making dozens of small decisions correctly. A tea picker who harvests at the optimal moment of the morning when the dew has dried, but the sun has not yet concentrated the sugars unevenly, is contributing to a quality that will still be detectable in the cup thousands of miles and several months away, if everything else along the chain has also been done correctly. The water, as Lu Yu insisted in the 8th century, matters enormously. His ranking of water sources: mountain springs best, river water acceptable, well water least desirable, reflected an intuitive understanding of how dissolved minerals affect extraction and flavor, which modern water chemistry has confirmed and elaborated. Hard water, high in calcium and magnesium, inhibits the extraction of certain flavor compounds and produces a flat, sometimes harsh cup. Soft water extracts more completely and produces a rounder, more complex flavor. The ideal water temperature varies by tea type. Green tea brewed at boiling point turns bitter and harsh because the high temperature extracts compounds that require gentler conditions to behave themselves. Black tea, particularly the robust Assam and Ceylon, blends favored in Britain, can handle boiling water and generally benefits from it. The instruction on every British tea package to use freshly boiled water is not nostalgic ritual. It is correct brewing advice, because water that has been boiled twice has lost dissolved oxygen that contributes to flavor clarity. The vessel in which tea is brewed also has effects that are both practical and cultural. The teapot, that most iconic of British domestic objects, produced in stoneware and porcelain and silver and cast iron in designs ranging from the elegantly minimal to the aggressively peculiar, functions both as a brewing chamber and as an insulating container, allowing the tea to steep properly and remain hot long enough to be poured into multiple cups. The development of the British teapot as a designed object tracks the history of British ceramics from the Chinese porcelain that arrived with the tea in the 17th century, creating an immediate market for domestic imitations through the Staffordshire potteries that developed the distinctive English styles of the 18th and 19th centuries, to the Art Deco designs of the 20th century, and the self-consciously whimsical novelty teapots that became a cultural category of their own. Chinese tea culture by contrast, had evolved toward much smaller brewing vessels. The Gongfu tea ceremony of Fujian and Guangdong uses tiny clay teapots, often no larger than a fist, designed to brew small quantities of highly concentrated tea that is consumed in thimble-sized cups over multiple infusions, with each infusion revealing a different aspect of the leaf's flavor profile. This approach treats the tea with a kind of analytical attention that the British tradition, which brews a large pot and adds milk and possibly sugar, tends not to prioritize. Neither tradition is wrong. They simply represent different philosophies about what tea is for and what pleasure means. The question of milk in tea deserves its own moment of attention because it is one of the things that most clearly separates the British relationship with tea from the Chinese original. Milk was not added to tea in China. It was not added to tea in Japan or Korea or most of the rest of Asia. It was adopted in Britain partly for the practical reasons mentioned earlier, tempering the heat to protect fine porcelain, and partly because milk was a readily available British agricultural product that happened to interact with the tannins in strongly brewed black tea in a way that reduced bitterness and added body. The proteins in milk bind to some of the astringent polyphenols in tea, softening the flavor profile and producing a rounder, creamier drink that is genuinely different from, and to British palates genuinely preferable to, the same tea without milk. The addition of milk transformed the flavor of the product so thoroughly that it essentially created a new beverage from an old ingredient. Sugar in tea followed a similar logic, becoming widespread as sugar prices fell in the 18th and 19th centuries, adding sweetness that counterbalanced the natural bitterness of strongly brewed black tea and providing calories that had genuine nutritional value for working people whose diets were often calorically marginal. The combination of tea, milk, and sugar, a warm, sweet, stimulating beverage that could be prepared in minutes and consumed quickly, was a package deal that fitted the conditions of industrial working life so precisely that it seems almost designed for the purpose, which it was not, of course. It was simply evolution, a plant's chemistry meeting a culture's circumstances and producing something neither could have arrived at alone. Historians still argue whether the British adoption of tea contributed meaningfully to the productivity improvements of the Industrial Revolution, the argument being that a sober, alert, hydrated workforce operating on boiled water rather than flat ale and contaminated well water was genuinely more productive than the alternative. The counterfactual is impossible to test, but the correlation between the spread of tea drinking among the British working class and the acceleration of industrial output in the 18th and 19th centuries is at least interesting, and the people who make the argument are not obviously wrong. What is not arguable is that by the Victorian era, tea had woven itself into the fabric of British life so thoroughly that its absence would have been felt as a form of deprivation with no obvious precedent. It was the first thing in the morning and the last thing in the evening and the answer to every crisis in between. It was the offer made to someone who had received bad news and the celebration offered to someone who had received good news. It was what you made when the doctor came, and what you drank when the doctor left. It was, in a nation not generally given to extravagant emotional expression, the primary vehicle through which care was communicated. the cup placed in front of a person who was cold or tired or grieving or frightened, without words, with the simple warmth of the vessel in the hands. The leaf that Emperor Shen Nong tasted in a Yunnan forest sometime in the 3rd millennium BC had traveled a very long way to reach this particular expression of human kindness. But perhaps, in the end, this is what it was always moving toward. There is a particular quality of light in a tea garden at dawn that painters have tried to capture, and photographers have chased, and writers have reached for, and none of them quite get it right, because it is less a visual phenomenon than a total sensory experience. The mist lying in the valleys between the rows, the dew on the leaves catching the first pale light, the smell of green and wet earth, and something floral underneath it all, the silence broken only by birdsong and the distant sound of other pickers beginning their work on the far side of the hill. If you have ever stood in a tea garden at first light, in Darjeeling or the highlands of Sri Lanka or the ancient gardens of Yunnan or the misty hills of Fujian, you understand immediately why the people who grow tea tend to describe their relationship with the plant in terms that sound to the uninitiated ear slightly religious. There is something about this particular combination of landscape and light and smell that produces a quality of stillness in the human nervous system that is difficult to achieve in any other way. We have talked at length about the history of tea and the commerce of tea and the chemistry of tea. Before we approach the end of this journey, it seems right to spend some time with the people who actually grow it. Not the merchants or the emperors or the company directors or the duchess with her sinking feeling at 4 in the afternoon, but the men and women who are out in the gardens before the sun is fully up, doing the work that makes everything else possible. Modern tea cultivation is global in a way that would have been unimaginable to the Tang Dynasty merchants who first carried compressed bricks along the Hexi corridor. Tea is now grown commercially in over 50 countries, on every inhabited continent except Europe and Antarctica. The major producers, China, India, Kenya, Sri Lanka, and Vietnam, account for the vast majority of global output, but smaller industries exist in countries as varied as Japan, Taiwan, Nepal, Georgia, Turkey, Argentina, and even, in tiny experimental quantities, the United Kingdom itself, where gardens in Cornwall and the Scottish Highlands have established that Camellia sinensis can survive a British climate if you are patient and somewhat stubborn about it. China remains the world's largest tea producer by volume, growing approximately 3 million metric tons of tea per year across a landscape of extraordinary diversity, from the ancient jungle tea trees of Yunnan that are harvested by climbing to the manicured, precisely terraced gardens of Hangzhou, where Longjing Dragon well tea is pan-fired by hand in woks heated over wood fires, to the rocky hillsides of the Wuyi Mountains in Fujian, where oolong teas of extraordinary complexity are produced using a multi-step process of withering, shaking, partial oxidation, and repeated firing that requires years of skill to master. The range of teas produced in China alone, over 2,000 distinct varieties, represents an accumulation of agricultural and processing knowledge so vast that it constitutes one of the largest bodies of applied botanical expertise in human history. India's tea industry, built on the foundations laid by Robert Fortune's botanical espionage and the labor of generations of workers in Assam, Darjeeling, and the Nilgiris produces approximately 1.3 million metric tons per year, making it the world's second largest producer. The Assam Valley, a broad, flat plain in northeastern India, watered by the Brahmaputra River, warm and humid and intensely green, produces the thick, malty, brisk black teas that form the backbone of most British breakfast blends. The tea bushes here are low and dense, kept pruned to waist height for easy picking, spreading across the valley floor in a green carpet that stretches to the tree line at the valley's edge. The plucking standard in Assam is typically 2 leaves and a bud, done by hand by workers who move methodically through the rows with fabric bags hanging from their foreheads by a strap, the weight of the gathered leaves resting against their brows as the bag fills behind them, covering roughly 12 to 15 kilograms of green leaf per day in good conditions. Darjeeling, by contrast, lives at altitude and produces smaller quantities of significantly more expensive tea. The gardens cling to steep hillsides above the town of Darjeeling in the foothills of the Himalayas, where the altitude ranges from 3,000 to 8,000 feet, and the thin mountain air and dramatic temperature swings between day and night produce a leaf with an intensity of flavor that larger volume, lower altitude production cannot replicate. Darjeeling has 4 distinct harvests, or flushes, each with a different character. The first flush of late March and April, made from leaves that have spent winter resting and emerge with a delicate, light, slightly astringent quality that tea enthusiasts pursue with something approaching competitive obsession. The second flush of May and June, which produces the famous muscatel character, the monsoon flush of the wet season, and the autumn flush of October and November, which is fuller and rounder than the spring teas. First flush Darjeeling from a reputable garden can sell for extraordinary prices, hundreds of pounds per kilogram at auction, making it one of the most expensive agricultural products per weight in regular commercial production. Kenya, which entered the tea industry in the 1920s under British colonial direction, has become the world's largest exporter of black tea by volume, producing approximately 500,000 metric tons per year from gardens concentrated in the highlands around the Great Rift Valley at elevations between 5,000 and 9,000 feet. Kenyan tea is notable for its brightness and consistent quality, produced largely by smallholder farmers who grow tea on plots of a few acres and bring their green leaf to central processing factories, a cooperative model that was developed specifically to make tea cultivation accessible to small-scale farmers rather than concentrating production on large estates. Kenyan CTCT, cut, tear, curl, a mechanical processing method that produces small granular particles rather than whole or broken leaves, is the backbone of the strong, fast-brewing tea bags that account for the majority of British tea consumption today. The tea bag itself represents the most recent major revolution in the British relationship with tea, and it is worth noting that it arrived by accident. The American tea merchant Thomas Sullivan began sending samples to customers in small silk pouches in around 1908, intending the pouch to be opened and the tea emptied into a pot in the usual way. His customers, being practical people, discovered that they could simply drop the whole pouch into a cup of hot water and get an adequate cup of tea with considerably less fuss, and began requesting more of the little pouches. Sullivan recognized the commercial opportunity and developed the concept. Deliberately, the tea bag arrived in Britain in the 1950s and was initially regarded with considerable suspicion by people who felt, with some justification, that it produced an inferior cup. They were correct, but convenience is a powerful argument, and by the 1970s, the tea bag had overtaken loose leaf as the dominant form of tea consumption in Britain, where it now accounts for approximately 96% of all cups made. Historians still argue whether the rise of the tea bag represents a genuine improvement in access and convenience that democratized quality tea consumption, or a commercial simplification that degraded the product and trained a generation of consumers to accept a lesser experience as the standard. The answer is probably both simultaneously, which is the kind of ambivalence that tends to make food historians interesting at dinner parties. The loose-leaf traditions that the tea bag displaced have not disappeared. They have retreated into a smaller market of enthusiasts and connoisseurs, where they thrive with the specific intensity of things that have been liberated from mass market obligations and can be pursued purely for their own sake. Specialty tea shops, online retailers, and a growing culture of tea appreciation have developed in Britain and across the Western world over the past 2 decades with the enthusiasm of people who have discovered something that was hiding in plain sight all along. The gongfu brewing methods of Fujian, the Japanese tea ceremony, the careful temperature-controlled steeping of high-grade Chinese greens and oolongs. All of these have found audiences in the West that would have been unimaginable even 30 years ago, when most British consumers had no concept of tea existing in any form other than a bag dunked in a mug. The global tea industry today produces approximately 6 million metric tons of tea per year, consumed by roughly half the world's population in some form. It employs, directly and indirectly, somewhere between 30 and 50 million people across the growing, processing, trading, and retail chains. It generates annual revenues of somewhere around $50 billion globally. These numbers have the blunt quality of economic statistics, and they do not capture anything important about the actual experience of tea. The smell of a good pot brewing, the warmth of the cup in cold hands, the pause it creates in the middle of a difficult day. What they do capture is the scale of the journey from a mountain forest in Yunnan to every kitchen on earth, a journey that began with a leaf falling into a pot of boiling water. Or perhaps it did not begin exactly that way. Perhaps the legend is a legend, and the reality was slower and less dramatic and more interesting, and continued through every century and civilization and catastrophe that followed, arriving finally here in the middle of the night, in whatever room you are in right now, with whatever cup is cooling beside you. The mist is still on the mountain. The leaves are still being picked right now in gardens on the other side of the world, where the sun is already up and the dew is already drying. The story is still going. There is something quietly extraordinary about the fact that you can walk into almost any shop in Britain today, anywhere from a petrol station on a motorway to a corner shop in a city backstreet to a grand department store in central London, and for less than the cost of a newspaper, buy a box of tea bags that will produce approximately 80 cups of a beverage whose journey to that shelf involved 2,000 years of trade, war, espionage, botanical discovery, imperial politics, and the labor of millions of people on 6 continents, the commodity has become so ordinary that its extraordinariness is almost invisible. This is perhaps the most complete form of success a thing can achieve, to become so essential that nobody notices it anymore. But people do notice, of course, not always in the grand historical way we have been exploring tonight, but in smaller and more personal ways that are, in their own fashion, equally interesting. Tea is noticed when it is absent. The particular anxiety of the British traveler abroad who cannot find a proper cup, the institutional comfort of the tea trolley in hospitals and offices, the ritual significance of the first cup of the morning made in a particular way that has not changed in decades. Tea is noticed at moments of transition, births, deaths, marriages, crises of all kinds, when the making of it is the thing a person reaches for, because it is the most immediately available form of active care. Tea is noticed with deep and sometimes disproportionate feeling when someone makes it wrong. We are approaching the end of tonight's journey, and it feels right to spend some time thinking about where this ancient story has arrived in the present and where it might be going, because the tea industry of the 21st century is in a state of change that is genuinely interesting and that echoes in surprising ways some of the dynamics we have been following for the past several thousand years. The most significant shift in global tea consumption over the past 20 years is the explosion of tea drinking in the producing countries themselves. China, which produces more tea than any other nation, has also become one of its largest consumers, with a domestic market that has grown dramatically as urban incomes have risen and a sophisticated tea culture that appreciates the full range of Chinese teas, from the lightest, most delicate white teas to the deeply aged pure teas that are stored for years or even decades and develop flavors of a complexity that wine merchants would recognize, has re-emerged among younger Chinese consumers who are reconnecting with their tea heritage after generations during which Western-style beverages seemed more modern and desirable. The generational wheel has turned. Young Chinese professionals in Shanghai and Beijing are now seeking out single-origin teas from ancient Yunnan gardens with the same enthusiasm that young British consumers of the same generation are seeking out single-origin coffee from Ethiopian highlands. The premium end of the global tea market is growing precisely at the moment when the mass market middle is under pressure from other beverages. India, similarly, is the world's second largest tea consumer, as well as its second largest producer, with a domestic market of extraordinary scale and diversity. The masala chai that is drunk across India, black tea boiled with milk and water, and a blend of spices that typically includes ginger, cardamom, cinnamon, cloves, and black pepper, sweetened with sugar, served in small glasses or clay cups called kulhads that are traditionally broken after a single use so that no caste distinction is maintained through shared vessels, is one of the most widely consumed beverages on earth. Prepared by chaiwalas on street corners and in railway stations, and by home cooks in kitchens from Kashmir to Kerala, and it bears a family resemblance to the Silk Road tea traditions of Tibet and Mongolia that traveled its same general direction centuries earlier, carrying the same leaf in different vessels. The chai latte that has become a fixture in Western coffee chains is a distant, considerably sweetened, and somewhat defanged descendant of the Indian original, adapted for palates that find the real thing aggressively spiced. But its very existence in Western markets represents a curious reversal of the old trade flow. Flavors and techniques that originated in the tea-producing world are now flowing westward as consumer preferences, which is a form of cultural exchange that the Sogdian merchants of Samarkand would have understood perfectly. The environmental dimensions of tea production in the 21st century are increasingly impossible to ignore. The tea plant requires specific growing conditions, the right altitude, rainfall, temperature range, that are sensitive to climate change in ways that are already beginning to affect production in some of the world's most important growing regions. Darjeeling, whose precise combination of altitude, mist, and temperature produces its famous muscatel quality, is experiencing changing weather patterns that are altering the timing and character of the flushes in ways that tea garden managers are documenting with considerable concern. Assam, which depends on predictable monsoon patterns, is seeing increased variability in rainfall that affects both yield and quality. Kenya's highland gardens, currently among the most climatically stable in the world, are projected to face significant growing condition changes by the middle of this century. Historians still argue about the relative weight of different factors in tea's historical spread, whether it was the caffeine, the cultural associations, the practical utility of a safe hot beverage, or simply the accumulated momentum of a commodity that had been moving through trade networks for long enough that its absence was inconceivable. But the researchers studying the future of tea are unanimous on one point. The geography of optimal tea growing will shift over the coming decades, and the industry will need to adapt in ways that go beyond what the existing infrastructure and knowledge base can easily accommodate. The response from the industry has been mixed. Some producers investing in shade growing, high-altitude adaptation, and organic methods that reduce dependence on chemical inputs while building soil health. Others intensifying production in ways that prioritize short-term yield over long-term sustainability. The specialty tea sector, which focuses on quality rather than volume and therefore has both the margin and the incentive to invest in sustainable practices, is generally more progressive on these questions. The commodity end of the market, where the pressure is always toward lower prices and higher volumes, is slower to change. There is also the matter of labor, which has been a complicated subject in the tea industry since Robert Fortune's plants arrived in Assam and the first indentured workers were recruited to tend them. Tea picking is still done almost entirely by hand. Mechanical harvesting exists, but is used primarily for lower-grade commodity teas because the precision required to select only the correct leaves at the correct moment of development is beyond what current machinery can reliably replicate. This means that the quality of premium tea is still fundamentally dependent on human labor, specifically the skilled, experienced, and attentive labor of people who know exactly what they are looking for on a plant and can select it correctly while moving at a pace that makes the work commercially viable. These workers, predominantly women in most producing countries, a fact that reflects both the historical assignment of agricultural tasks by gender and the genuine physical suitability of smaller, more nimble hands for precise leaf selection, are the last link in a chain of human skill and effort that stretches back in an unbroken line to the mountain farmers of ancient Yunnan, who first worked out how to take a wild tree's leaves and make something worth drinking from them. Their knowledge is specific, local, and embodied, held in the hands and eyes and noses of people who have been doing this work since childhood, and transmitted through observation and practice, rather than textbooks or training manuals. The UNESCO recognition in 2022 of China's traditional tea processing techniques as intangible cultural heritage of humanity was an acknowledgement of exactly this kind of knowledge, the kind that lives in people rather than in documents, and that is therefore vulnerable to loss in ways that written records are not. The global tea industry in 2026 is a system of such complexity that tracing any single cup of tea back to its origins requires navigating a supply chain of extraordinary intricacy, from the garden, through the processing factory, through the broker's warehouse, through the blending facility, through the packaging plant, through the distributor, to the retailer, to your kitchen. The distance between the leaf on the plant and the tea in your cup is no longer measured only in miles or months, but in the layers of commercial and logistical infrastructure that have accumulated between them. This is not entirely a bad thing. The efficiency and scale of the modern supply chain is what makes tea affordable and accessible to billions of people who could not afford it if it were still a luxury traded one camel load at a time. But it does mean that the connection between the consumer and the origin of the product has become extremely attenuated, which is why the movement toward direct trade, single origin, and artisanal teas resonates with people who want to recover some sense of where this thing actually comes from. The answer to that question, where does tea come from, is, at its deepest level, the story we have been telling tonight. It comes from a mountain in Yunnan, from a plant that evolved its chemistry over millions of years before any human thought to taste it. It comes from a legend about an emperor and a falling leaf, which may or may not be true, but is certainly beautiful. It comes from the hands of the pickers and the knowledge of the processors and the courage of the caravan drivers who crossed the Taklamakan in summer and the Pamirs in winter. It comes from the ships that raced each other down the Atlantic with all sails set, and from the political decisions of a young prime minister who understood that a 119% tax was a very bad idea. It comes from a Portuguese princess who arrived in Portsmouth and asked for tea and was given ale, and from a duchess who felt hungry at 4 p.m. and decided to do something about it. It comes from all of these things simultaneously, which is the nature of anything that has been part of the human story for long enough. The cup in your hand is the end point of a journey so long and so complicated and so deeply interwoven with the history of civilizations that it seems almost impossible it could result in something as simple and as good as this. And yet, here it is. Here you are. The lights are low now. The fan is turning somewhere nearby, outside, wherever you are in the world. And I hope you have told me in the comments exactly where that is and what time it is there, because I genuinely want to know. The night is doing what nights do. Settling, deepening, letting the day go. We began this journey in a mountain forest in Yunnan, standing beside a plant that didn't know it was about to change the world. We have traveled with it across the most extreme terrain on Earth, through cultures and centuries and commercial systems of enormous complexity, through courts and caravanserais and London coffee houses and the holds of racing ships. We have watched it become medicine, then currency, then philosophy, then contraband, then empire, then the most ordinary and essential thing in a nation's daily life. We have met the people who carried it, and the people who taxed it, and the people who stole its secrets, and the people who died bringing it over the mountains. We have stood on the docks of the Thames and heard the creak of 1,000 masts, and sat in the drawing room of a duchess who was simply hungry at 4 in the afternoon, and changed British social history by doing something about it. It is time, as all journeys eventually require, to come home. What strikes me most, returning from this particular story with all its layers and distances, is the thread of human desire that runs through it from beginning to end. Not the desire for tea specifically, not in the first instance, but the more fundamental desire for something warm and restorative and slightly extraordinary, something that makes the difficult parts of being alive a little more manageable. The Tibetan nomad drinking butter tea at 14,000 feet in a Himalayan winter, the Tang Dynasty scholar in Chang'an warming his hands on a clay bowl while the city outside prepares for another cold night, the English factory worker in 1840s Manchester, standing in the thin gray light of a winter morning, waiting for the kettle to boil before a 12-hour shift, the Duchess, privately, quietly, doing nothing more revolutionary than deciding she deserved a small pleasure in the middle of the afternoon, all of them reaching for the same leaf for reasons that were practical and physiological and cultural and deeply, specifically human. Tea spread across the world not because empires carried it, though they did, not because merchants profited from it, though they did, not because governments taxed it into significance, though they tried. It spread because wherever it went, the people who encountered it recognized something in it that they needed, a quality of warmth and alertness and calm that the human nervous system, it turns out, is almost universally receptive to. The chemistry was always there in the leaf. The desire was always there in the people. The Silk Road was simply the mechanism by which they found each other. The ancient tea-horse road that wound through the mountains of Sichuan and Yunnan and Tibet has become, in many of its stretches, a heritage trail, hiked by tourists and photographers and people who want to feel the weight of history under their feet. The stone trail surfaces worn down by centuries of porters carrying impossible loads are still visible in places, those shallow depressions pressed into rock by the accumulated weight of all that tea moving over all those years. If you press your hand into one of those worn patches of stone and let yourself think about what made it, the number of footsteps and the number of years and the number of human lives that contributed to that small hollow in the rock, the feeling is something between awe and vertigo. History has a physical texture, and tea's history is written into the landscape of 6 countries in exactly that way, in worn stone and ancient trees, and the faded trade routes visible from satellite images as pale lines across the brown of desert and the gray of mountain. The clipper ships that raced each other from Fuzhou to London are almost entirely gone. The Cutty Sark survives, preserved in dry dock at Greenwich on the south bank of the Thames, her hull painted black and her masts still impossibly tall against the London sky. 11 miles of rigging carefully maintained by conservators who know they are keeping something irreplaceable. If you stand beneath her hull in the museum space underneath and look up at the copper-sheathed bottom that once cut through the Southern Ocean at 16 knots with 10,000 chests of tea in her hold, the ship feels alive in a way that preserved things sometimes do, as if the speed she was built for is still somehow present in the lines of her waiting. She is the most tangible physical object that connects the tea in a British kitchen to the racing drama of the 19th century China trade. And she is worth visiting if you ever find yourself in London with an afternoon to spare and a tolerance for standing in the wind. The East India Company, which dominated and in many ways defined Britain's relationship with tea for nearly 2 centuries, dissolved formally in 1874 after the British Crown took direct control of Indian administration following the 1857 uprising. Its warehouses became part of other enterprises. Its records, extraordinary, exhaustive, the most comprehensive commercial archive of the early modern period, are held at the British Library in London, where historians still mine them for evidence of everything from shipping routes to the price of black tea in 1743. The company's legacy in Britain is celebrated in some quarters and contested in others, which is the appropriate response to an institution that simultaneously drove one of the most consequential commercial expansions in history and inflicted enormous harm on the peoples it exploited to do so. History is not comfortable, and the tea in your cup carries the whole of it. The Twinings Tea Shop at 216 Strand in London, opened by Thomas Twining around 1706, is still there. It is possibly the oldest retail shop in London still operating on its original site, a narrow shopfront that has survived the rebuilding of the street around it through 3 centuries of commercial London. Walking in, the smell hits you immediately. That specific, complex fragrance of many different teas in an enclosed space, layered and warm and ancient feeling, the smell that the shop has had in some form for over 300 years. It sells loose leaf teas of every description alongside the packaged blends that made the brand famous, and on any given day, the customers include tourists who have made a pilgrimage to a piece of tea history and local office workers who have simply run out of their usual brand and ducked in for a replacement. The ancient and the quotidian sharing a narrow shop on the Strand. Tea has always managed this somehow, the capacity to be simultaneously historic and entirely ordinary. In the tea gardens of Darjeeling, the first flush harvest of 2026 will have happened by now. In the cold, bright mornings of late March and early April, when the air at altitude is still sharp and the new leaves are at their most delicate and most prized, the pickers will have moved through the rows in the early light, selecting with the precision of long practice, filling their bags with the season's first offering, leaves that will be processed within hours of picking, withered on bamboo mats in airy sheds, while the smell of fresh green fills the building, then carefully oxidized and fired and sorted and graded and packaged and shipped to buyers in London and Tokyo and New York and 100 other cities whose inhabitants have been waiting, some of them with genuine impatience, for the new season's tea. In Yunnan, the ancient tea trees on Pamir Mountain are being harvested by farmers who can name the trees they work from and estimate their age in centuries, whose families have tended these specific plants for generations, who carry knowledge of the mountain's microclimates and soil variations and seasonal rhythms in their bodies rather than their notebooks. The pu'er tea pressed from these ancient tree leaves will be stored for years or decades, aging in dry stone warehouses where temperature and humidity are carefully managed. The chemistry of the compressed cakes slowly transforming under conditions that nobody fully understands, but everybody respects. Some of what they press today will not be drunk for 20 years. Some of it will be drunk by people who have not yet been born. The long patience of tea is one of its most quietly remarkable qualities. And in a kitchen somewhere, perhaps where you are right now, or where you were an hour ago before you settled in for the night, a kettle is boiling or has recently boiled, and a cup is being made with a speed and casualness that gives no indication whatsoever of the 4,000 years of history compressed into the act. The bag is dropped in, the water poured, the milk added, first or second according to personal conviction. The cup lifted, the first sip taken. This is what it was all for. All the desert crossings and the mountain passes and the racing ships and the political crises and the wars and the botanical espionage and the legislative reforms, all the backs that bent in the gardens and the hands that rolled the leaves and the merchants who spent their lives on the road, all the camels, patient and bad-tempered and irreplaceable, all of it, every moment of it, for this cup, in these hands, right now, in the quiet of the night, Emperor Shen Nong, sitting under his tree with his pot of boiling water nearly 5,000 years ago, would understand completely. He tasted the leaf. He found it good. He would be pleased to know how far it went. Drink your tea. Let the warmth settle into you. Let the day recede. There is nothing left to do tonight but sleep. And the sleep that comes after a long journey, even a journey taken lying still in the dark, moving only through time, is the best kind there is. You have traveled very far tonight, and you have arrived exactly where you needed to be. Sleep well wherever in the world you are. I will be here when you need another journey. And if tonight's journey brought you something, a little warmth, a little wonder, a little of that particular calm that good stories and good tea both produce, the feeling of being briefly held by something larger than the ordinary day, then please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps, and it means the next journey can happen sooner. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for the comments that tell me where you are and what time it is there, because those comments are in their own small way the modern version of the Silk Road. People from different corners of the world connecting briefly in the dark over a shared story, before returning to their own lives and their own nights. The mist is still on the mountain. The leaves are still growing. Good night.